Chapter 911 Eyes of Vengeance. China, Chongping District, near what was once Yangfang Town. It was in this place that one of the two most important bases that the Transcendent faction possessed in Chongping District was located. In fact, there were only 2 human bases that existed in the entire district, and although there were already projects to build 2 more bases, such projects would first have to wait until the conquest of the country was completed and the already captured territories were established. This was the base that in the past was under the control of Wu Keqian, eldest son of the Wu family and former mayor of Changping District. It could be said that this was the first large-scale base that Bai Zemin conquered after he and his group crossed the bridge known as Eastern Dragon's Back, because although by that time the Transcendent faction already had a few tens of thousands of human troops, this number was simply pitiful compared to the more than 200,000 that Wu Keqian's base had at that time. Although this was not the main base of the Transcendent faction, it was undoubtedly an important strategic point since it was this base, the one supporting the base built by Bai Zemin's faction further north in Chongping District prior to the conquest of the Yangfang Town base. A base which was the faction's first defense against the marine race and the forces of the enemies in the north. In addition, the base of Yangfang Town was where the most destructive weapon of the entire faction was located. This weapon was none other than the great battleship whose technology surpassed that of the current Earth by a large margin, and it would probably take at least 4 or 5 centuries of past technological evolution to be able to build something similar. The Sky Destroyer was no longer at ground level as before, but was hidden underground. Over 200 soul evolvers carefully worked to dig a large subway cave in which the battleship was hidden, and the vault was sealed at the top by an alloy door forged from a variety of rank 1 and some rank 2 metals. Only a handful of people could enter there, and the operators who had been chosen to observe the ship's functions had been very carefully selected. The number of operators numbered only 12. All of them soul evolvers above level 25 with classes which made it easy for them to operate all kinds of means of transport or turn them into something similar to geniuses when it came to computers. This was a normal day for the operators. Noon had just passed and the team had just had their lunch while they chatted amongst themselves and paid occasional attention to the Sky Destroyer system. In reality, they didn't have to do much and the pay was surprisingly high, so they treasured the position and trust the higher-ups were giving them. The group of 12 were chatting quietly when a slight light on the large front screen flashed on the lower left side. This is Bai Zemin addressing to the Sky Destroyer. I repeat, this is Bai Zemin addressing to the Sky Destroyer. For a few seconds, the room fell silent. After taking a few seconds to look at the small green dot on the lower left of the screen, the 12 looked at each other and all could see the pupils of their companions trembling fiercely. One of them practically jumped on the command console and pressed a digital button while shouting in a trembling voice, "L leader, leader Bai. It's the leader. Quickly report to the second leader Shangguan." Is this really the real leader? Of course it's him. Xietain District. Shangguan Bing Shui was preparing to send Evangeline and Wu Yijuan to the north of China. She had just finished a brief but important meeting regarding what was happening in the north of their territory, when her attention was suddenly drawn to the small military radio on her waist. Thanks to many modifications made by soul evolvers with technology-type classes, military radios now had a range incomparable to the past. Although the use of soul stones was required to power the device, thanks to the Sky Destroyer acting as a central antenna, they only needed to use unclassified soul stones, or first order at worst. She picked up the radio and spoke in a cold voice, "It's Shangguan Bing Shui. L leader, second Shangguan. This is Lin Xiaoyan, leader of the team of operators in charge of supervising the warship under the name Sky Destroyer." Shangguan Bing Shui's expression changed when she heard the mention of the Sky Destroyer and slowly asked, "Did something happen to the ship?" The Sky Destroyer was one of the biggest trump cards of the entire Transcendent faction, not only because of its terrifying destructive and defensive power, but also because of the many functions the battleship had. To say that the Sky Destroyer was the reason why all the bases of the different districts, cities, and prefectures could communicate with each other was all thanks to the Sky Destroyer was not an exaggeration at all. Shangguan Bing Shui definitely could not let anything bad happen to the battleship, not after having already failed to keep the people close to Bai Zemin alive. Even if Zhongde was a powerful soul evolver, Shangguan Bing Shui should have remembered that no one's life was on their pockets in this world. And no, it's not the ship, but it's the leader. Leader? Shangguan Bing Shui repeated. The sudden change of subject perplexed her, and for an instant her brain didn't process what was going on. That's right, it's the founder leader. Mr. Bai Zemin just contacted us and informed us that he is flying from the United States to China. Lin Xiaoyan's voice trembled with excitement as he exclaimed those words. Shangguan Bing Shui's pupils trembled fiercely, and the indifferent expression on her face turned to shock in a single second as she held the radio in her right hand and stared into nothingness after falling down in a daze. Had it not been for the fact that she was alone at this moment, she would definitely have scared anyone nearby. However, it was highly improbable that she would care. Second leader? Is everything all right? Lin Xiaoyan asked upon receiving no response for several seconds. Lin Xiaoyan Shangguan Bing Shui clenched her teeth tightly and made a pause as her voice began to tremble. After several deep breaths, she carefully said, Bai Zemin, which base is he heading to? Leader Bai is on his way directly towards here. Lin Xiaoyan replied respectfully. He said to report this to you and that he hopes to be able to meet with the following people. Shangguan Bing Shui listened to Lin Xiaoyan naming several people as her heart pounded, and after cutting off the communication she couldn't help but lean back against the wall as she looked up at the sky with a relieved expression on her face. She gently closed her beautiful blue eyes, and two crystalline lines of tears slid silently down her fairy-like face as her lips murmured in a whisper, "Welcome home." The whole faction practically went crazy, and even the normal survivors noticed that something big was happening when they saw the always proud and aloof high officials who held important positions in the different bases were rapidly moving all over the place like anxious ants. As dozens of helicopters with fighter swooped towards the distant horizon from the more than 150 bases under the control of the Transcendent faction, military vehicles that were rarely seen being used for patrolling were now continuously passing all over the streets of the base, where Bai Zemin would be arriving in a few hours. As helicopter after helicopter flew through the sky and landed at the military base before several armored vehicles guarded by soul evolvers set off towards the tallest building located in the center of the establishment, the clueless survivors naturally began to get a little uneasy and whispered among themselves as they pointed at the passing vehicles. Even then, none of them was scared to the point of going crazy. There had been several zombie attacks in the past, and the number of times the mutant beasts attacked during the previous months was not small, but even so the base always stood as firm as Mount Tai. This made the survivors begin to trust more and more in the troops and the government, and now very rarely did chaotic situations arise, not to mention that everyone knew in their hearts that the punishment for rebellion was life imprisonment at best and death at worst. At the Bai family house, Yi Linger, Meng Qi, and Bai Dilan looked in confusion at the number of helicopters and planes arriving at the base. "Dad, do you know what's occurring?" Meng Qi asked in confusion. Her beautiful face was radiant as always, but in her eyes one could see fatigue both mentally and physically. Not only Meng Qi but Yi Linger was the same, or even worse, with dark circles under her eyes getting more pronounced every day. It had been almost half a year since Bai Zemin disappeared without a trace or any words left behind, and although they knew he was alive thanks to those who were linked to his soul, it was impossible not to worry and be afraid as a family. Every day that passed was a living hell for them. Bai Dilan shook his head at his daughter's question. "No. It seems to be orders from very high up, but we were asked to stay at home. Even I was not informed of anything of this." Bai Dilan was tremendously confused. Although he did not boast about it, it was unquestionable that he was the father of the highest authority in the entire faction, right? He could not understand why he was being denied information about what seemed to be such a big movement, and even received an explicit call from Shangguan Bing Shui requesting him and family to stay at home. Yilinger shook her head and turned around to return into the house as she said in a tired voice, "No matter what is happening. If we have more time to spend as a family, then it's good for us." Back in the Artemis-class helicopter, Bai Zemin sighed in relief, and without worrying about his appearance, he plopped down on the back of the couch. After a short communication with the operators of the Sky Destroyer, Bai Zemin learned that although they had indeed been attacked with nuclear missiles repeatedly, a secret technology that disconnected and shut down any nuclear-powered device caused those missiles to become a pile of scrap metal in mid-flight. "Are you sure you don't want to inform your family of your return?" inquired Angelo with a slight smile, before adding, "I learned Chinese during high school. I'm glad your family is safe and sound, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you." Bai Zemin nodded. He continued, "I need first to do something with my eyes before I meet my family. Or at least think what to tell them about it." It was he who had asked Lin Xiaoyan to tell Shangguan Bing Shui for her to see to it that his family did not learn anything yet. This was because Bai Zemin wanted to meet with his family in private and not in a meeting room, and he also needed some time to calm his heart and chaotic thoughts. "Speaking of your eyes," Eleonora interrupted, and as she stared at him she couldn't help but ask curiously, "What's with that eye color of yours? Even the sclera has turned red and you look like you have no pupils at all. When I first saw you, I thought you were a genuine demon. These eyes." Bai Zemin looked out the window and said in a low voice, "These eyes are the eyes of vengeance." It was at that moment that Eleonora managed to see a little more of what was in his head, and her face turned pale as she realized that the man in front of her might soon become a genuine demon. Rather than feeling fear, however, she couldn't help but get hit by the sadness he felt. Chapter 9-12 Meeting again after half a year, approximately 17 hours later. Although the flight speed of the Artemis-class helicopter was amazing and incomparable to any other helicopter built on the pre-apocalyptic Earth, the size of the world had almost quadrupled, so flying from the eastern United States, across the Atlantic Ocean, Europe, and about 3 or 4 other small countries to China naturally required a lot of time. /N, yes, as strange as it may sound to you, the distance between the US and China is shorter through the Atlantic. You can search info about it at will. The trip was not particularly smooth either, as during the course of the flight there were several flying mutant beasts that attacked the Artemis-class helicopter, and among them were herds of first-order beasts led by some second-order ones, and there was even a big third-order flaming bird that flew close to the helicopter before deciding to retreat after it sensed the terrifying auras in the interior. It was near dawn, and the base lights were illuminated in some of the richer areas, while the poorer ones could only use things like kerosene, as although all the bases had some high-tech power generators, the faction could not afford to waste soul stones on existences that did not contribute anything positive to their survival. The fact that they were still being well fed could be considered the ultimate kindness that in times of crisis would be shown to them. "Oh, so this is a Chinese base?" Dylan looked out the helicopter window and exclaimed, "This will be a good time for tourism, won't it? Ha ha ha, I've never been to any other country besides the United States. Or at least that I remember." Eleonora looked sideways at him and said casually, "Dylan, we're not here for sightseeing." Dylan glanced sideways at the small, white-haired, sickly-looking girl sitting on the opposite couch before scratching his head and settling back into his own place. I know, Eleonora snorted. She looked at Callie silently. She had tried to engage her in conversation several times, but the girl not only didn't respond to her at all, but literally ignored her existence, despite Eleonora speaking in Chinese. In the cockpit, Bai Zemin sat in the co-pilot's seat, and it wasn't long when a signal from the ground reached the helicopter base, addressing to the unknown assault helicopter, "Identify yourself within the next 15 seconds, or you will be shot down. Repeat, identify yourself within the next 15 seconds, or you will be shot down." Angelo looked at Bai Zemin with a smile and said in a joking tone, "If you don't want to be greeted by your people with fireworks, you better respond." Bai Zemin pressed one of the buttons and said in a deep voice, from the assault helicopter to base, "This is Bai Zemin. Do not fire. Leader?" The other person's voice paused for a moment before he requested in a respectful voice, "Name confirmed. Code word needed please." Anyone could use Bai Zemin's name to enter the base, as it was impossible for each and every soldier or operator to know his voice and appearance. Therefore, for this kind of situation they had prepared some words that no more than 10 people in the entire faction knew. Bai Zemin glanced sideways at Angelo before calmly saying, "Lilith." After a few seconds of silence, the same man's voice was back, but this time it sounded much more respectful and enthusiastic. "Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Leader Bai." The airstrip of the military base was lit up with all kinds of bright lights. There were all kinds of military vehicles, including some battle tanks, assault helicopters, and even 4 Chengdu J-20 Fighters. In the center of the airstrip, a small number of people looked up at the sky with different but at the same time similar emotions beating in their chests. Hearing the unmistakable sound of the rotor of an approaching helicopter, Wu Yijuan's eyes lit up and her heart began to pound harder than before. "He's coming," she said softly as she took half a step forward in the midst of her anxiety. Wu Keqian and Sun Ling looked at their daughter with somewhat sad expressions in their eyes. Only they knew how many times during the nights Wu Yijuan visited them they heard her praying to all kinds of gods in her room. Chen, he looked at his childhood friend and sighed in his heart. He was one of the few who had lent a friendly shoulder when Wu Yijuan cried, and thus was also one of the few who had seen her lose weight during the past months. Chen He's eyes moved to the silver white-haired woman holding the small hand of a pretty little girl with bright silver hair, and he could not help but smile bitterly in his heart. Looking from behind at the outline of Shangguan Bingshui's figure, Chen he could feel his heart thumping faster. He had really tried very hard to forget his childhood crush. He had even gone as far as trying to meet other very beautiful and powerful women. However, every time Chen he saw Shangguan Bingshui his whole world trembled, and those feelings he tried to bury broke through the ground to come back to the surface stronger and deeper than before. Shangguan Xingyue patted his shoulder in an attempt to comfort him as she sensed his slight depression. She looked at her daughter's back for a moment before raising her head skyward to watch the large, peculiar-looking helicopter slowly descending. Her sky-colored eyes glittered slightly as she stayed silent. Kong Lan, Evangeline, Xiao Ming, and a handful of other soul evolvers who had been following Bai Zemin for a long time watched as the helicopter landed gently on the airstrip. Not much time passed when the 6 rotors that kept the beast in the sky began to slow down and the noise to diminish. When the sliding door on the left side of the helicopter opened, everyone automatically held their breath. Bai Zemin with Callie on his back was the first to get off the helicopter and took a few seconds to look at the people a few meters in front of him. At the same time, they were also looking at him as if to make sure they were not seeing an illusion. Bai Shirling's eyes lit up like stars in the sky, and she was about to rush forward to throw herself into Bai Zemin's arms when the wind swooshed in her ears and a figure rushed ahead of her. "Ah! That's not fair." The girl let go of Shangguan Bingshui's hand and quickly dashed forward as if she feared being too late. Bai Zemin froze for a brief moment when his nostrils were assaulted by an exquisite fragrance of purity and nature. Because his hands were holding Callie from the bottom of her thighs, he might have reacted by trying to push away or draw the person who had entered his embrace like a bird, returning to its nest after a long time of being lost. As to how he would have reacted, that would probably be a mystery forever. Seeing the young beauty's delicate body trembling slightly and hearing the low but indistinguishable sound of a girl crying, Bai Zemin could not help but sigh in his heart. "You've become slender again." Bai Zemin smiled bitterly in his heart as his words seemed to make things worse. Wu Yijuan literally could have thrown him to the ground if not for their huge difference in stats, and his clothes would have been soaked if not for him wearing his battle armor. A moment later, another person slipped in on Bai Zemin's right side and hugged him. Bai Zemin looked in amazement at the little girl who raised her head to look at him with bright eyes and a beautiful smile. "You Are you Sherlin? Silver hair, shining black eyes, black markings on her arms. Not to mention the connection he felt being near her, this girl was definitely by Sherlin, there was no doubt about it. However, Bai Zemin was certain that the last time he had seen Bai Sherlin a little less than half a year ago she was no different than a 2 to 3 year old girl. How had she jumped from 2 to 3 years old to 8 to 9 years old in appearance? Bai Zemin felt that his head was too small to process it all. Hee, father. Bai Sherlin smiled sweetly and said with impossible to hide joy, Sherlin has grown this big now. Sherlin has been a really good girl. Sherlin has leveled up and killed the bad villains. The voice of the young girl grew fainter and fainter as she listed her feats one by one. She finally lowered her eyes and rested her small forehead on Bai Zemin's body as she said in a trembling voice, Sherlin. Sherlin really missed father a lot. Mommy said that father would be back soon, so Sherlin waited patiently. I really behaved well so, don't leave Sherlin behind again, please. Hearing Bai Sherlin's low sobbing and pleading voice, Bai Zemin felt as if his heart was being cut to pieces and a pained expression crossed his face as he looked at the contrast between hair as black as night and hair as silver as moonlight. Bai Sherlin was his daughter, but he had only been with her for a month at most, because after that Bai Zemin had no choice but to leave her behind. Now that he had returned almost half a year later, Bai Sherlin had grown up a lot and Bai Zemin had missed many important milestones of that growth. While he was being overwhelmed by diverse emotions that turned his mood into an even bigger mess than it already was, Bai Zemin raised his head when he heard a series of footsteps approaching. Wu Keqian patted him on the shoulder and nodded as he said softly, It's good that you're back, child. Sun Ling gently stroked her daughter's hair and said with a charming smile, You'd better make it up to my little girl for all the suffering she went through, little brother Zemin. Yijun really had a hard time during this time because of your absence. Wu Yijun didn't bother to say anything against her mother's words and didn't even care how embarrassing it might be. She simply refused to move away and continued to cling to Bai Zemin as she was afraid for her heart at this moment. I'm sure our leader will definitely take his responsibility as a man. Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bingshue's mother, whose petite body made her look like Shangguan Bingshue's little sister instead of her mother. This woman's charm was even higher than Sun Ling's, even though her body definitely did not own the same curves and her class was not related to charm. Shangguan Xinyue smiled gratefully as she slowly said, Thank you for that time, Bai Zemin. I will be eternally grateful to you. Bai Zemin shook his head and said under his breath, There's nothing to be thankful for. I was just keeping my promise. Just keeping your promise, Shangguan Xinyue closed her eyes gently and smiled slightly before taking a step to the side. This was the first time the two of them had a chance to talk, and despite Shangguan Xinyue having many things she wanted to tell Bai Zemin, she knew this was not the best time for it. Xiao Ming stepped forward and gave a military greeting, Leader Bai, I'm glad you are well. Bai Zemin looked at this man who was previously not much different from a bandit but was extremely loyal to him, to the point of being willing to die for his sake. Xiao Ming had changed a lot during this time, and although he still had a certain air of rakishness around him, he had grown into a true top warrior. Except for Kong Lan and Evangeline, who stood back as if waiting for something. Bai Zemin exchanged brief words with the few people who were close enough to him to be allowed to be in this place, and at that moment, he stepped forward and looked at Bai Zemin for a few seconds. The expression on his face was indifferent, but he finally smiled and clenched his fist. He gently pounded his chest and said with sincerity, It's a relief that you're back. All of us have been waiting for your return. Like Wu Yijun's grandfather, Chen He's family would have been doomed had it not been for the relationship he had with Bai Zemin and his very high position in the faction. Looking back and remembering those days when he disagreed with Bai Zemin's actions, he realized how much he had grown as a man and how wise he had been by listening to his subconscious ironies of life. He had expected the help of his family during the initial days of the apocalypse, but in the end, it turned out that he became the backup of his family. because thanks to him, they were still alive and could live luxuriously. All thanks to him betting on the right leader, a leader with no track record but a brilliant one. Finally, Baizemin's eyes fell on the only person left. Even though she had been the one who had reacted the most calmly among all those present, and despite the indifference in her expression, those two beautiful blue eyes that shone like precious jewels looked at him with more intensity than anyone else. Shangguan Bingshui used her big eyes to look into the red eyes of the man younger than herself a few steps ahead of her, and although she had not been by his side for almost half a year, she seemed to be able to understand how much hardship he had gone through while he was away from home. His face had not changed much, however, and even though he could not absorb more soul power by now, Shangguan Bingshui noticed that he had become more handsome. This was because the Baizemin in front of her had matured a lot, and somehow the aura around him was now far more charming, to the point where he looked like a completely different person. It was as if she was looking at someone who had lived for thousands of years and gone through countless heavens and hells. At the same time, as Baizemin used his sharp blood-red eyes to look into those two beautiful sky-colored eyes, he seemed to be able to feel all her sorrows, even though the gorgeous woman's expression was indifferent. Moreover, he could not help but notice the clearly unnatural paleness on her face, and for the first time, he felt that Shangguan Bingshui was fragile, not weak but fragile. Her back was straight and her shoulders pulled back, her chin held high and her eyes were firm. Everyone, regardless of their position or identity within the transcendent faction, viewed Shangguan Bingshui with admiration, reverence, and fear. No one would ever think about associating her with the word fragile. However, all Baizemin saw was the slender silhouette and small shoulders of a girl who had been forcing herself to not fall. Shangguan Xinyue couldn't help but smile as she saw the fixed gazes of the two as Sun Ling and Wu Keqian sighed in their hearts. Finally, and after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Shangguan Bingshui took something out of her pocket without taking her eyes off his. She did not comment anything about the blood-red color of his eyes, but instead reached out her hand and calmly said, "I have taken care of it for you, just as you asked me to." Baizemin looked at the small wooden pagoda in Shangguan Bingshui's white palm, and when he looked back into her eyes, she smiled slightly and said with shining eyes, "Welcome home." This was the second time Shangguan Bingshui had said these words in less than a day, but this time she was able to say them to the person toward whom they were meant. Chapter 913, Third Order Evangeline. Baizemin did not exchange many words with Shangguan Bingshui and the others. Not only this was not the best moment, but there were people present who needed to be introduced first. "Oh!" Dylan couldn't help but exclaim as he looked at the fighter jets several meters apart. His eyes glittered as he subconsciously asked, "Hey, Angelo, Eleonora, do you think these Chinese fighters are better than our F-35 Lightning? I'd like to see both of them fighting in the clouds." Dylan's voice was quite loud in the middle of the night, not to mention that the military base was located on a site considerably remote from any other part of the base, so noises from outside hardly reached this part of the human establishment. In addition, the robust man's English was unmistakable to anyone. It was unnecessary to say that the expressions of some of those present changed noticeably after hearing Dylan's voice, especially those who had some mastery over English. "American?" He frowned slightly, and a glint of wariness flashed in his eyes. As a member of a family that before the apocalypse had its roots firmly planted within the Chinese army, he naturally knew a little about the U.S. fighter airplane under the name F-35 Lightning. Moreover, the American accent was simply unmistakable to him. "What? American?" Xiaoming opened his eyes wide and looked at Dylan with sharp eyes. The past he might have cursed, but now he was able to restrain himself in certain circumstances. Wu Yijuan slowly raised her head from Baizemin's chest, but did not move far away from him. While using her small left hand to cling to her cloak, she used her big black eyes that shone especially brighter tonight as a result of the tears she had just shed to look at the unknown group. Angelo's eyes sparkled slightly as his eyes met Wu Yijuan's, and in his heart he could not help but exclaim in shock at the beauty of the woman in front of him. Western beauty differed from Eastern beauty. For example, American and European women were usually more curvaceous than Asian women, and this could be seen at this very moment as the curves displayed by Eleonora, who was only 19 years old, were only matched by Sun Ling's already fully matured body. However, Angelo was momentarily captivated by Wu Yijuan's pure and angelic face as her sad expression and the tears dangling from her long eyelashes magnified her characteristics even more. Even then, Angelo had no shortage of beauties to embrace. Besides, it was clear that this woman in front of him had a very high position in this place, and from what he had heard before, her feelings for Baizemin were evident to everyone gathered here. Angelo had no plans to start a fierce war between factions all to get a woman. This is... Wu Keqian also raised his wariness as he looked at the group of three. Baizemin turned slightly and introduced them calmly. These three are members of the elite team of the faction that is probably the most powerful faction in the United States right now. The most powerful faction in the United States? Several alarm bells rang in everyone's heads when they heard these words, and the wariness grew in everyone's hearts. In fact, Baizemin noticed that some of those present were looking at him with eyes that seemed to be talking. It was as if they were asking him why he had brought such dangerous and powerful people to this place, a military base that had so many secrets that could not be known by others. Eleonora grimaced and ignored everyone as she played with her nails casually. Angelo naturally noticed the wariness of the people before him, something completely normal. He stepped forward and spoke using fluid control over the Chinese. My name is Angelo Gallagher, but it is not necessary to mention my last name when you address me. Gallagher? Wu Keqian muttered as he rubbed his chin. That surname I have heard it several times before, but where? Angelo Gallagher, 27 years old. Only male son of the former and last president of the United States and currently leader of the faction that controls roughly half the country in the extreme east. An indifferent voice attracted people's attention, and Angelo could not help but look at Shangguan Bingshui with surprise. He had naturally already noticed this woman. It was impossible not to, considering that she was the most beautiful of all the females present by a considerable margin. However, Angelo could also sense danger of death coming from that seemingly delicate and perfectly proportioned curvy body. Baizemin also looked at Shangguan Bingshui with a hint of surprise. She looked at him and said in a soft voice, "We have a satellite base so we can see some movements in the world now, though only in some parts since most of the satellites went down." Satellite base. Baizemin couldn't help but smile with bitterness in his heart. A lot had happened. After all, it had been almost 6 months since he left Earth. He really needed to catch up with everything that had been happening in his faction. Although possessing a satellite base did not explain why Shangguan Bingshui knew the American faction so well, Baizemin did not ask any more questions for now, as this would surely reveal information that was best held in secret. Be that as it may, Baizemin continued, the thing is that due to certain events I ended up on American ground and met Angelo's team not long after. They lent me that helicopter to return to China, and since the helicopter is state-of-the-art, naturally they couldn't send me alone. They all looked at the Artemis-class helicopter and finally understood a little better what was going on. The Artemis-class helicopter was not only huge in size but had over 5 cannons of different sizes on each side, with a larger cannon located at the front. This kind of beast could not be compared to anything they had seen before, and even the 4 Chengdu J-20s on the airstrip could not compare when it came to imposing appearance. Baizemin looked at Angelo, but before he could say anything Eleonora stepped in front of him. Hey, Baizemin. Don't tell me you're planning to send us back home? This? Baizemin was a bit speechless since he was indeed planning to do that. Eleonora put both hands on her hips and gasped in indignation. We've been flying for more than half a day from one end of the world to the other to get you here safely, and you already want to scare us away? It seems your China manners are not so good after all. Baizemin hesitated for a moment as to what to do next here. Eleonora's words were valid. Besides, Baizemin hoped to form at least a temporary alliance with the United States faction, as this would make things Much easier for his future conquest. However, he also could not risk having such powerful people in one of his bases, especially since Xietain could not have his eyes on them for long as a babysitter since he had things to do. Angelo seemed to realize the problem, so he stepped forward to lighten the mood a bit as it began to get heavy. Don't worry, we'll be leaving tomorrow before noon strikes. I understand your apprehension. If I were you, I would probably find it difficult what to do in this situation. After a moment's thought, Xietain nodded and calmly replied, all right. Eleonora rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Xietain added, this time his voice getting some depth to it, however, let me warn you of something. You better not try to sneak in anywhere or break the rules of my place or I will not be indulgent with any of you. Angelo nodded calmly as Dylan stepped forward and said with wide eyes, hey, Xietain. We can at least tour the free parts of the city, can't we? This is my first time visiting another country. Man, I've always been curious about Asian beauties, he. You can tour the free parts of the city at will. There is a lot of entertainment that has been going on since I gained control over this establishment. Xietain nodded before giving one more warning. Lastly, let me warn you too in particular that rape is penalized through death in my faction. If you wish to satisfy any kind of need, you will have to pay the proper price and receive approval from whoever sells said service first. Angelo looked at Dylan and the latter nodded to indicate that he understood. Satisfied, Xietain pulled out some colored papers from his storage ring and after making sure there was only enough to have some fun at ease handed them to Angelo. Angelo, I will have one of my people guide you to one of the hotels near the military base and to show you to your rooms. You can do whatever you want within the rules I mentioned just now after that. On one of the higher floors of one of the more luxurious hotels on the base, Angelo looked at the view outside the window, which, despite being as transparent as glass, it was clearly different as whatever they had used to make it was definitely capable of withstanding medium-caliber bullets. Did you find anything? He asked calmly as he looked out at the starry night. There were a few hours before sunrise. Sitting on the sofa and drinking orange juice, Eleonora said in a serious voice, Angelo. Apparently Xietain was away from home for almost half a year after the previous president of China fired a nuclear missile when he retreated defeated from the battlefield. Besides, that woman from before is actually Xietain Wentian's illegitimate daughter. Angelo was silent for a moment before nodding, I see. Considering the overpopulation problem China was experiencing and the one-child per family law, it's no wonder Xietain Wentian hid his daughter. No. Far from hiding his daughter, that old man apparently threw her aside next to her mother and didn't bother about them. Eleonora shook her head before she said with enthusiasm, however, I bet you don't know where this Xietain guy was after Xietain Wentian launched the nuclear missile even without caring about his daughter's life? Oh? Where could it be? In another world? For a few seconds, Angelo said nothing. Eleonora couldn't help but laugh as she read his mind and continued, Angelo, this Xietain character really opened a portal to another world and took the nuclear missile with him. That's why he doesn't know the current situation of his faction, and if you think about it carefully it would also explain the reason why he suddenly appeared in the United States. Because of Abyss's spatial disturbance. Angelo muttered, seemingly entranced. Bingo. Eleonora snapped her fingers with a beautiful smile and nodded. However, her expression soon became tremendously serious as she said in a low voice, Angelo, this Xietain guy really is a monster. I couldn't get much information, but from what I could read from the mind of one of the girls it seems that he's still at level 50 without being able to break in the second order. What? Angelo turned abruptly, and his eyes trembled as he looked at Eleonora in shock. Eleonora, are you kidding me? Eleonora's serious expression was answer enough for the leader of the United States of America. How? How can that be possible? Muttered Angelo with wide eyes. First order? He overwhelmed that level 152 monster to the point where he made it look like a toy, so he's clearly stronger than me if I don't use solemn sacrifice to the max, but he's just a level 50 soul evolver? It seems to be, honestly, even I find it hard to believe it, but that's the truth. Eleonora sighed and nodded. I think we'd better suspend the idea of being enemies of China. At least for a few years, we'd better focus on getting as strong as possible. This guy, Bai Zemin, is simply too mysterious. That woman, Shangguan Bingshui, she seems to be in the same situation as you since she's been stuck in the second order for months now, so maybe she's not inferior to you in terms of power, Angelo. It took several minutes for Angelo to be able to calm down. He looked outward and asked now more calmly, where is Dylan? Where else? He went to visit the cat houses. Eleonora pursed her lips and sneered. According to him, his goal is to learn about the culture and customs of other countries. Man of culture, or so he said. Angelo nodded, and after a moment of silence, he sighed. If Bai Zemin really was in another world, then we can't rule out that he has a gateway to visit other Earths at will. This means that he most likely brought many things with him. Eleonora had difficulty reading Angelo's mind now that his thoughts were slightly in disarray. Her skill was passive, so even she wasn't able to control it, and whether she wanted to or not, she was constantly hearing voices in her head, and that's the reason for her personality not being very friendly. It was already a miracle that she didn't lose her mind. Besides, everyone who knew about her mind-reading skill stayed away as much as possible. After all, no one wanted to be around a person who could read their darkest secrets. Even Angelo sometimes stayed away from Eleonora, and she knew that he was weary of her since Eleonora knew too many things because of this skill of hers. However, Angelo was someone Eleonora admired and was grateful to, as he had saved her in a difficult time years ago. All right. Angelo nodded. His serious expression was reflected slightly in the glass before him as he said, slowly, I know what we will do. It will be beneficial to all of humanity, and it will make our relationship with Bai Zemin's faction grow. Oh? And what would that be? Eleonora frowned in puzzlement. Angelo turned to look at her and said in a deep voice, exchange of information and technology. Sitting in a spacious living room, Bai Zemin listened to Evangeline's report with a relaxed expression on his face. After she stopped, Bai Zemin continued petting Bai Shirleen's hair that was sitting on his lap with a happy smile while a thoughtful expression crossed his face. To think that little brat can actually read minds. Looks like she's not as stupid as I thought. I'll have to do something to counter this, but it's a good thing Angelo's a smart guy. He nodded calmly. Evangeline was now a level 132 soul evolver, since in contrast to Shangguan Bingshui, who was still stuck, she had managed to complete her evolution requirements about a week ago. She was now so stealthy that even Bai Zemin in his present condition could not sense her, and her attacks had definitely become so fatal that she would probably be able to put Shadow Killer to shame. She was the highest level soul evolver in the entire faction apart from Shangguan Xinyue, and her power had reached a stage where probably only Bai Zemin could handle her. If it came to killing, even Shangguan Bingshui would have to be careful of her in an open field. Because Bai Zemin felt that something did not seem right about Eleonora's supposed sneaking into the helicopter, he sent Evangeline to follow them. However, he definitely did not expect to uncover such a big secret, and thanks to that everyone could now be more cautious. Although Eleonora had already discovered some things, none of it was information that could harm Bai Zemin or his faction. In contrast, and if they played well, it could even be beneficial, depending on the extent of Eleonora's skill, of course. Chapter 9:14 Kali Lilith, a huge secret. There were only a few people inside the large room as Bai Zemin had dismissed the rest, telling them that he would be holding a larger meeting tomorrow for them and the other high commanders who had arrived at the base from the different territories under the control of the Transcendent faction, temporarily putting aside the matter of the American soul evolvers as they did not seem to be a threat at the moment thanks to their leader. Bai Zemin looked at the few people in the room. Chen He, Wu Yijuan, Kong Lan, Evangeline, and Shangguan Bingshui. Of course, there was also Bai Shirlin, who was now asleep sitting on his lap. As for Kali, the girl was tired, so Bai Zemin took her to the room that was meant for him to rest. There was no need to worry about Callie's safety. This was Shangguan Bing Shui's house after all. Before I tell you about my experiences during the last half year, I would like to know what happened, he asked in a deep voice. Although Bai Zemin's voice sounded quite calm, and although they had all been away from each other for so long, the people present had been with him practically since day one, with the biggest exception being Evangeline, who joined about 2 months after the world changed. They could feel his anger and sadness burning deep in those red eyes that seemed to be the living representation of rage. The room was silent for a moment before Shangguan Bing Shui looked him straight in the eyes and said in a firm voice, Zhong De died. I am sure you already know it, and that is the cause of the color of your eyes. I will explain to you what is happening, but let me start from the beginning. Shangguan Bing Shui remembered that apart from this, there were 2 other occasions when Bai Zemin's eyes turned blood red. In fact, she was the only existence in the entire Transcendent faction who knew this about him. The first time was during the battle against the goblins in the north of China when one of the goblin leaders threatened his family, and the second time was in Oblong World after Shangguan Bing Shui was about to lose her life after being fatally wounded by the giant hawk that was a level 100 beast while she was still in the First Order. Even knowing practically nothing regarding this peculiar characteristic of Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui could draw a conclusion or two about it. All right, I'm all ears. Bai Zemin nodded as he stroked the girl's silky hair in his lap in an attempt to cool a little of the boiling blood running through his veins. He could restrain himself when he was away from the issue at hand, but now that he was close to knowing the truth, it was hard to restrain himself. Losing almost 20% of his total rationality was not a matter to scoff at. Shangguan Bing Shui was silent for a minute, and after clearing her thoughts she began to narrate what happened in a summarized but easy-to-understand manner. After you crossed the portal to another world to take away the nuclear missile fired by Xianyuan Wendian and save our lives, I admit that I got a little out of control. I ordered the troops to advance instead of retreating and waiting, crushing the 2 new China bases that same day and killing more than probably needed to be killed. Fortunately for us, Xianyuan Wendian did not launch another nuclear attack again, despite the fall of all their bases in Xietain district. Thanks to my mother and Sherlin, I managed to regain some common sense, so I did not continue to press forward. Doing so might have alarmed Xianyuan Wendian even more, and if he had already fired 1 missile, there was no guarantee he wouldn't fire a second. Except that we wouldn't have you to ward off the danger this time. Shangguan Bing Shui paused as she got here. Everyone noticed that she was also a little agitated at the memory of her own helplessness, so no one said anything. After a few seconds, she continued, about 3 or 4 weeks later, while Xietain was making reforms in the government cabinet of the new bases and replacing the upper echelons with more trusted people, a man named Hua Lim requested to meet with me saying he had important information regarding Xianyuan Wendian, so I agreed to meet with him, and this was one of the big turning points for our faction. It was then that Bai Zemin learned about the blueprint for building a system to deactivate any nuclear weapons that were not registered in the system. Any nuclear-powered weaponry would be deactivated and become waste after penetrating within the 20-kilometer range. After seeing the direction from which the nuclear missile was launched, it was not difficult to know where to set up each nuclear nullification device. Shangguan Bing Shui explained as she looked at Bai Zemin firmly. After a few months of hard work and effort, the different teams of our faction managed to find the materials needed to build the nuclear nullifiers, and thanks to you focusing not only on the search for soul evolvers with classes intended for combat but also for technological development, it was not too difficult to build them. After securing each base with at least 2 nullifiers, I no longer held back and charged with an army towards Xietain district, taking down one of the new China bases in less than 2 hours. I see. Bai Zemin nodded. He now understood the reason why Xianyuan Wendian launched more nuclear missiles and could not help but tremble with fear inwardly at what might have happened had it not been for the existence of these devices. Shangguan Bing Shui hesitated for a moment before slowly saying, I defeated Xianyuan Wendian and captured him alive. He is locked in a special ice shell I built myself. Bai Zemin looked at her in confusion when he heard this. Don't get me wrong, I'm honestly relieved you didn't kill him. For better or worse, the fact that he is your father cannot be denied regardless of everything else, he said after a brief pause. However, may I know why you keep him alive? I don't think it's so simple after all. The hatred Shangguan Bingshui felt for her father was a hatred she had carried throughout her life from a very young age. Bai Zemin found it strange that she did not kill him to free herself from that hatred she felt. During the past months, I have thought many things, and I realized that you are right. Hating someone who contributed to my personality would be the same as hating that part of me. Besides, during the past half year, I realized something. Shangguan Bingshui paused as she reached this point. She looked at Wu Yijun and a glint of uneasiness flashed in her blue eyes, but no one noticed it, not even Bai Zemin. Bingshui? He looked at her puzzled at her abrupt pause. She hesitated before saying under her breath, during this half a year that passed, I realized that my hatred for this man seemed to have changed its source. That's why I decided not to kill him. Your hatred changed its source. Oh. At first, Bai Zemin was blank as he did not understand what Shangguan Bingshui meant by those words. However, he soon understood that she was talking about Xianyuan Wendian sending him away from home. He sighed and said softly, I admit that I hate this man too. But, you don't have to go this far for me. Bingshui, remember that we are destined to become eternal existences. Just make sure you don't let regrets to haunt you forever, that's enough. Kong Lan subconsciously shook her head upon hearing Bai Zemin's reply. She looked at Shangguan Bingshui and Wu Yijun, noticing that the latter looked at the former with a friendly smile while Shangguan Bingshui sighed in relief. Although Evangeline said nothing, the corner of her mouth trembled slightly, but the movement was so small that no one noticed it. Be that as it may, Xianyuan Wendian is locked in a jail dungeon under my villa in Xietain district. You take care of him later, it's your decision. Shangguan Bingshui continued quickly. Bai Zemin nodded in agreement. Xianyuan Wendian was the least of his worries at the moment. He was nothing but a defeated person, nothing in his eyes. Shangguan Bingshui's expression turned serious again as she resumed, while I and a small part of the army were in charge of attacking Xianyuan Wendian's forces, most of the troops who were not defending our bases moved in different directions and began to conquer different territories. You probably already know this, but at this moment our faction has taken over almost half of the country. This is because I rushed the conquest process, because I am aware that one of your requirements to become a second-order soul evolver is to become the Lord of China. A flash of anger shone in Shangguan Bingshui's eyes as she said in a low voice, everything was going well except in the north. Do you remember Liangpeng? Liangpeng? Bai Zemin frowned in confusion, you mean the head of security at our university? It's him. Shangguan Bingshui nodded. Liangpeng formed his own faction in Yanqing district, but he could only gather a few thousand people, probably no more than 4,000 or 5,000, so he went to Inner Mongolia. According to our information, Liangpeng managed to build a fairly strong faction there, but was still no match for us. That good-for-nothing little scum also knew of your strength and mine, so using the fact that we were a group in the past, he managed to convince me from a long-distance communication to give him 2 days' time to organize things to hand over his power. She took a deep breath and said slowly, however, Liangpeng forged an alliance with another large faction in Inner Mongolia and even managed to join hands with a large goblin faction operating there. As if that wasn't enough, the Russian army is also sticking its nose in, and according to the soldiers we captured Liangpeng and the other human leader, promised them a large sum of resources in exchange for military strength. So? Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and subconsciously clenched his fist for a moment before remembering that Bai Sherlin was sleeping in his lap, forcing himself to remain calm at least on the outside. The other side has a great store of power, they even have 8 third-order soul evolvers now. A union of 2 large human factions, plus tens of millions of goblins, and the intervention of a large foreign Faction is something even we can't take care of unless we treat it seriously. That's why I sent Zhongde, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, Nangong Lingxin, and Nangong Yi to lead the troops in the north. Shangguan Bingshui said. She looked into his eyes and bit her lips to the point of drawing blood as she said with regret and guilt, Zhongde was ambushed by 3 enemy soul evolvers, and according to Kai Jingyi's report, he fought to the end, killing 2 of the 3 third-order soul evolvers at the cost of his life. It was thanks to him that the army of soul evolvers following him was able to return safely. Bai Zemin stayed in silence for a long time, and his outward expression made it difficult for others to know what he was thinking or feeling. After what seemed like an eternity, he nodded and said in a surprisingly calm voice, I see. I understand. At the same time, Bai Zemin was having a conversation with Shangguan Bingshui and the others, in the room where Callie was supposed to be sleeping. The girl was sitting on the bed with her back resting on the backrest. Her eyes were closed, her small hands rested in her lap, and her emotionless expression in conjunction with the paleness of her face made her look like a doll rather than a living being. She sat silently for many minutes before an unnatural gust of wind gently caressed her hair. Callie softly lifted her head, and though her eyes could not see, she looked straight ahead. I knew you were coming. Is that why you lied about being tired? Okay, I see. Thank you. It's early to say thank you. It will depend on your explanation if I tell him what I found out about you. Of course. Lilith smiled bitterly at Callie's unfiltered words. She looked at her curiously and asked, genuinely confused, Little sis Callie, aren't you scared of me killing you? Although I will indeed suffer a severe punishment, it is not fatal enough to stop me, you know that too, right? You won't hurt me, Callie said without hesitation in her tone of voice. Lilith walked over to her after blinking a couple of times and sat down next to her on the edge of the bed. She looked at her in silence for almost 2 minutes before asking in confusion, and what makes you so confident? Callie looked in her direction and said casually, if you hurt me, Bai Zemin will suffer. That's not what you want, is it? Not to mention, he is currently emotionally influenced. If he takes another blow, now his personality will break forever. Hee. Lilith softly grabbed a lock of Callie's white hair and gently swung it like a flag while saying with a smile, I bow down to you, you clever little monster. Callie was silent for several seconds before asking under her breath, you. Who are you? Who am I? Lilith stood up and walked to the window as she said to herself, that's a question I've asked myself many, many times. Sometimes I've even wondered if instead of who I should use the word what for that question. The room was silent for almost 10 minutes, neither Callie nor Lilith uttered a word during that time. Finally, Lilith broke the silence. I guess I should start from the beginning to make it easier for you to understand. She turned with a beautiful smile and said in a playful voice, Sis Callie, after listening to this you have to promise me that you won't tell anyone anything. This is a huge, huge secret that even the most powerful ones don't know after all. That will depend, Callie said, devoid of emotion. It seems like everything in your life now turns around him? Oh well, that's also good for everyone though. Lilith chuckled and added, but, don't worry. I can assure you that after you hear my story, you will definitely keep it a secret from me. Chapter 9:15 Unmasked Say Princess, Frozen Sacrilege, Succubus. It was still a few minutes before the sun began to rise on the horizon. Standing in the backyard of Shangguan Bingshui's villa, the sound of the wind accompanied by the sound of the water of the 10-meter-long pool was the melody that accompanied Bai Zemin as he observed the sky that began to become clearer and clearer with each passing second. More than an hour had passed since Bai Zemin learned the reason behind Zhongde's death, but for him, that time had not passed at all as his mind was still in a kind of trance. In fact, he sent everyone to sleep and promised to tell them about his experiences in Eventide World in the near future. How could he be in the mood for such things? It was already a miracle that Bai Zemin did not rush north and cause an indiscriminate massacre for fear of leaving one of the culprits alive. He still needed to visit Zhongde's mother. Even if she had already been informed of her son's demise, Bai Zemin felt the obligation of paying his respects to her. At the end of the day, Zhongde was not just another subordinate. The sound of footsteps behind him did not alarm him. His eyes stayed fixed on the distance, and the distinctive scent of jasmine announced Shangguan Bingshue's arrival without her saying a word. It wasn't until about 5 minutes of silence later that Bai Zemin opened his mouth to take the initiative to say something. Eventide world is a world with 2 moons and 2 suns, but the stars are the same and the sky is no different from the one we see here. I wonder if all worlds under the rule of the soul record are under the same law of time, since even the length of day and night did not differ from that of our world. Were the nights of that world colder than the nights on our earth? Several times colder, but the people there had higher levels on average, so the night market is busy. Well, unlike our world and us, Eventide world and its inhabitants have had thousands of years to prepare themselves between a world evolution and the next, while we are in the second stage, even though it hasn't even been a year since the soul record broke through the door of our homes to enter our lives. Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bingshue after saying these words. She was looking at the sky, her eyes were steady as was her posture. Her white summer dress was definitely not to be worn considering the current temperature, but thanks to her ice and frost skills it was unlikely that this kind of weather could affect her. At least that was what others would surely see and think from seeing her at this time. However, when Bai Zemin looked at her, what he saw was something completely different. As she looked up at the sky, her pupils were slightly dilated and her eyes were trembling slightly. Her gorgeous figure looked extremely fragile, and the slight trembling of her body did not go unnoticed from his sharp eyes. Was this trembling from the cold? Was this trembling because of something that was bothering her? Bai Zemin did not know. All he knew was that the woman next to him was probably having her own existential problems. He looked up at the sky again and said softly, Bingshui, thank you for everything. What are you thanking me for? She looked at him in confusion. No, as I said, thank you for everything. Bai Zemin said in a serious voice. His voice was low but sincere as he slowly remarked, back at the university, it was you who saved my life after I collapsed following my battle against that first order beetle. You have been the one who has helped me the most so far in terms of physical actions, especially during this last half year that I was away from home. Regardless of whether at the beginning our relationship was a bit tense or whether we each had our own reasons for supporting the other, it is undeniable that you have worked very hard. Shangguan Bingshui said nothing and simply looked at him silently as he continued to gaze up at the now slightly orange-reddish sky on the horizon. I will be leaving for the north in a few days after spending some time with my family. You don't need to come, I think you deserve a good rest. But, Bingshui. Shangguan Bingshui jumped slightly in surprise when Bai Zemin interrupted her, this time in a slightly raised voice. He sighed and looked at her calmly as he said gently, I don't think I was the only one to notice, but you don't need to pretend to be strong in front of me. We are friends, aren't we? We haven't seen each other for many months, so I'd like to remind you of something. Bingshui, remember that you don't need to wear your mask at all times. I'm sure your mom, Chenhe, Wu Yijuan, and probably a few others are just like me and want to be of help to you. Shangguan Bingshui was powerful, so terrifyingly powerful that she could annihilate entire armies by burying her enemies in eternal ice statues. The number of existences capable of facing her in the entire world was definitely very low, and her confidence, as well as certainty in every step she took, had portrayed Shangguan Bingshui as a practically omnipotent being. In fact, Bai Zemin had no doubt that given the time he was away from Earth and considering that most of the upper echelons of the newly conquered bases did not know him, it was natural to think that in the minds of most of them the true leader was Shangguan Bingshui, even if his name was mentioned by her and the rest quite often. Were it not for the fact that she was loyal to him to the point of the absolute, Bai Zemin was certain that the soul record would have removed his titles and his subclass long ago. All this coupled with her cold and aloof personality had made everyone, perhaps even her closest friends, forget that Shangguan Bingshui was, at the end of the day, a young girl who months ago was just a college student. It might be presumptuous of Bai Zemin and perhaps sexist to think that it was a man's duty to carry the heaviest burdens, yet he was that kind of person and it was so ingrained in his records that he would never change. Even he was on the verge of collapsing on numerous occasions due to the responsibilities he carried, and the only reason he kept standing apart from Lilith was because Bai Zemin always kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, not daring to stop to look back for fear of realizing what he was giving up in exchange for an unknown future. This was also what helped him to move forward on the staircase to heaven. If even Bai Zemin was about to collapse, then what about Shangguan Bing Shui, whose shoulders were thinner and whose figure was more fragile than his? Shangguan Bing Shui looked at him with such a gentle expression that the ice itself would probably melt. Any man would feel his legs trembling if he was looked at by such a pair of beautiful and expressive eyes, but the man who was receiving that kind of gaze could not appreciate it as his emotional state was not right and his eyes were in the north sky. She looked at the profile of the man in front of her for several seconds before closing her eyes and letting out a giggle. Bai Zemin felt every bone in his body weaken as he felt that giggle. It was so low that it was not unlike a whisper in his ears. He looked at her and was slightly stunned for a second or two before closing his eyes tightly and calming down. Shangguan Bing Shui's charm had reached such a high degree that even Bai Zemin was not immune to it. The most frightening thing was that she didn't even seem to notice that there was anything strange about it, or maybe this was the real Shangguan Bing Shui that was hiding under so many fake masks. The only thing Bai Zemin knew was that Shangguan Bing Shui's charm didn't seem to be very far below Lilith's, although the latter was obviously holding back. Shangguan Bing Shui looked at him with kind eyes and said in a soft voice, "Friends, Under Bai Zemin's confused eyes, she closed the distance between them. To his surprise and disbelief, Shangguan Bing Shui took the initiative to cling to him and hug him in a way that, for a moment he stood frozen. After a few seconds, he subconsciously put up his hands with the intention of gently pushing her away when her voice stopped him. In the West, hugs between friends are not very uncommon, or are they? But, we're in the East, and our customs are different. Screw the customs. W.H. Bai Zemin was dumbfounded and what he wanted to say stuck in his throat as he looked at the top of Shangguan Bing Shui's head. This was the first time he had heard her curse like this, and Bai Zemin was willing to bet his virginity that, very probably not even Wu Yijuan or Chen, he had heard her say something like this. Bing Shui, you. He finally took his hands off her shoulders and let her do whatever she wanted while forcing a smile and shaking his head. Bai Zemin did not realize it at first, but the more he chatted with the woman in front of him the more obvious it became that although his anger, sadness, and thirst for vengeance were far from disappearing, the truth was that his madness was calming down a lot faster than usual. It was as if the raging volcano of fire inside him was being pacified by a fierce but gentle snowstorm. Shangguan Bing Shui raised her head, her eyes sparkled as she looked at him and a giggle not unlike that of an innocent little kid came out of her as she saw the expression on Bai Zemin's face. Hee, what's wrong? Didn't you say I should stop wearing masks at least in front of you? Well, there you go. We women can also curse when something bothers us, you know? Even if it's a beautiful one just how I am. For you yourself to say that you're beautiful. Bing Shui, I didn't know you were such a narcissist. Narcissistic? I don't think so. I'm beautiful, that's the truth. And telling the truth can't be considered narcissism, can it? Bai Zemin was speechless. Looking back over the first few days of the apocalypse, Bai Zemin felt it was unbelievable how much Shangguan Bing Shui had changed. However, looking at the beautiful woman looking back at him with bright eyes and a spring-like smile, Bai Zemin thought that maybe and just maybe, Shangguan Bing Shui had always been like this, but maybe, and just maybe, no one had been able to bring out this side of her. At least not until now. Bai Zemin had been speechless, but Shangguan Bing Shui had no intention of letting him go. It was as if she was releasing her frustrations on him as while hugging him like a little girl she spoke softly. Am I not beautiful? This question really caught him off guard. Shangguan Bing Shui was asking him if she was beautiful? Bai Zemin would stomp to death if someone said that she wasn't, since that would mean that there were no beauties in the universe. Don't say it. It's a trick. Bai Zemin could practically hear his father, Bai Dilan, whispering those words in his ear. My almighty second in command? Why are you asking me such a question? It was you who said I am being narcissistic, no? If you say I'm not beautiful, then I guess I'm a narcissistic woman. That's just the way it is. So, you tell me if I am beautiful or not. It's an existential doubt that needs to be answered very soon, or I will die. You're messing with me, aren't you? I'm messing with you, and what can you do about it? Quickly answer my question. I deserve it, don't I? I've taken care of your house while you were visiting other lands. Shangguan Bingshui snorted as she looked at him like a little pig who was not afraid of boiling water while staying almost completely glued to him. Bai Zemin could feel the corner of his mouth tremble several times. It took everything from him not to raise his right hand and spank her, but while repeating to himself that it was not right to do such a thing. However, it was becoming difficult to resist that impulse, especially since Shangguan Bingshui was being naughty as if. Suddenly, Bai Zemin's eyes flashed slightly, and as he looked at Shangguan Bingshui's blue eyes, he was not slow to notice something peculiar around the edges. Bingshui, you're at level 100 now, aren't you? That's right, 4 months now. Just out of curiosity, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but can you tell me what's the name of your third class? Shangguan Bingshui looked at him for a few seconds, and for some reason her charm grew considerably as her lips pursed softly. I don't know why I chose this class among the ones I could have chosen, but I guess you'll soon have 2 succubus shadowing you. You. Shangguan Bingshui chuckled as she saw the shocked expression on Bai Zemin's face while she whispered in his ear, my third order class is called Frozen Sacrilege Succubus. Chapter 9:16 Lilith Shangguan Bingshui, Frozen Sacrilege Succubus? At first, Bai Zemin blinked in puzzlement as he looked at Shangguan Bingshui's smiling face. However, when the little hamster that made his brain work began to run on its wheel again, Bai Zemin finally felt that he could understand what was going on. What kind of joke is this? Bai Zemin didn't know whether to laugh or cry, for which his expression was that of a somewhat forced smile. He. Shangguan Bingshui giggled innocently, but the spark of playfulness in her eyes was evidence of how much she was enjoying the reactions and expressions Bai Zemin was having thanks to her. Bai Zemin looked at her with a wry smile and said slowly, really? Succubus? Bingshui, why did you choose that class? Are you maybe a little seductress under that cold personality of yours? If the news that the cold, indifferent, and to some extent cruel Shangguan Bingshui had chosen the path of charm capable of driving both men and women alike crazy. Bai Zemin could already imagine the awakening kind of shock that everyone in the faction would get. I don't know if I'm a little seductress or not, Shangguan Bingshui let him slip out as she said those words. She didn't take her eyes off his as she took small steps back with both hands behind her back and said with a cute smile, however, why don't we wait and see? In the perhaps not so distant future you may be able to find the answer to your own question. A strange light flashed in Bai Zemin's eyes as he listened to her words. Bingshui, I just hope you'll be careful with your charm. To be frankly honest, even I have a slight problem maintaining my sanity while looking at you. And this is despite possessing the skill Immovable Heart, which weakens all status effects that affect my mind or soul by half. He said after a brief hesitation. Shangguan Bingshui looked at him in confusion before her eyes flashed with understanding. She looked towards the house to make sure there was no one peeping before looking back at Bai Zemin. Her expression was serious as she slowly said, I have been suppressing my charm all this time. Not even in combat have I used it despite it being part of my strength. What? Bai Zemin looked at her genuinely surprised and asked dumbfounded, why are you not using your charm in combat? Not using one of the traits of the path you chose to walk is simply nonsensical. Shangguan Bingshui looked deeply at him for several seconds before saying in a serious voice, it's because I don't want anyone to look at me with eyes that are filled with lust or desire. I have received many lustful glances during my life, Even when I was just a girl taking her first steps into adolescence, I could feel the weird looks of other men. But, however, Shangguan Bingshui stopped Bai Zemin as he was about to say something, and at the same time as she raised her voice a little, she also raised her hand to ask him not to say anything for now. At the same time as Bai Zemin looked at her perfectly white outstretched palm, she slowly retracted her hand while closing it into a fist, leaving only her index finger pointing upwards. Shangguan Bingshui brought that finger close to her lips, and while making a gesture of silence she winked at him, while saying in a playful voice, "There has been a single lustful glance that has not bothered me. That is why I am now releasing my charm completely for you to see me as I really am without modification. No more masks, this Shangguan Bingshui you see is who I am. You are the first person to whom I show myself unreservedly and completely naked. And I plan to keep it that way not only now, but also in the future." Bai Zemin wanted to say many things regarding what Shangguan Bingshui had just said. For example, he felt like asking her not to say words that could easily be misinterpreted by others. Completely naked? Bai Zemin was a healthy and perfectly straight man, while Shangguan Bingshui was an insanely beautiful woman. If he didn't react to those words, then he might as well become a eunuch. Exactly, that kind of look you put on just now is what I'm talking about. The smile on Shangguan Bingshui's face blossomed and her eyes glistened as she said unfiltered, "Until I come to understand myself better, you, Bai Zemin, will be the only man who will be able to see the true me. After that, and when I finally understand this part of my records that I cannot assimilate, we shall see." Bai Zemin froze and his expression changed slightly as a thought flashed through his head. Bingshui. I don't think that this is the case, but just in case I'll risk to lose all my face right now. You, don't tell me you. It seems these 6 months of leadership have helped you clear that mind of yours a bit, hasn't it? Bai Zemin jumped in surprise, and his words were interrupted by Lilith's slightly amused voice. He and Shangguan Bingshui raised their heads to the sky, and there she was. Lilith smiled slightly as she slowly descended. Shangguan Bingshui's eyes glinted warily, and her expression changed to coldness as he looked at her. Even she had to admit that even the slightest of Lilith's movements was packed with feminine charm. Every smile and every frown or the slightest of hand movements seemed destined to ignite the flame of passion in whoever looked at her, especially men. Lilith, this is... Bai Zemin paused, and a flare of surprise grew in his heart as he realized he was about to explain to his beloved that this was not what it seemed. He wasn't doing anything wrong, or at least so he thought. However, as he tried to explain himself, Bai Zemin revealed that in his subconscious he somehow felt or knew that the conversation he was having with Shangguan Bingshui was not a chat between normal friends. Lilith simply smiled at him with incomparable affection before looking at Shangguan Bingshui, who was looking at her as if she was looking at her greatest enemy. She chuckled and said with amusement, "Why are you looking at me like that? Believe it or not, I have just helped you." Shangguan Bingshui said nothing and simply looked at her for several seconds before closing her eyes and sighing. When she opened her eyes again, all that remained was indifference, and the Shangguan Bingshui from before seemed to have disappeared without a trace. "Zemin, don't you have something to do?" Lilith looked at Bai Zemin with a smile and asked, "Something to do?" He was surprised and looked at her blankly. However, when he saw Lilith pointing her finger to the sky and noticed that the dawn was already there, Bai Zemin understood what she meant. Crap, right. He turned to leave, but after taking a few steps he stopped. After wavering for a moment, Bai Zemin looked back without turning around completely and said with a small smile, "Bingshui, I'm glad you are safe and sound. Again, thank you for all your support so far and for all the support you will give me for the countless years to come ahead of us." Shangguan Bingshui smiled slightly and her eyes sparkled as she calmly said, "I plan to become your #1 partner." The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth slightly contracted only once when he heard Shangguan Bingshui's words and wisely decided to follow the #1 rule of the Bible to avoid problems when it came to women. He said nothing, turned around, and left without looking back. Lilith and Shangguan Bingshui remained silent for almost a full minute after they both saw Bai Zemin's silhouette disappearing beyond the now closed door of the house. Though Lilith turned with a smooth and graceful movement. She looked at Shangguan Bingshui with a faint smile on her face and said calmly, "Looks like these 6 months really were good for your growth. Thank you. I think I will reach at least level 135 or 140 after I complete my requirement to get my third order class." Shangguan Bingshui replied indifferently. Lilith chuckled and shook her head. "If you want to play dumb, then that's fine with me." She looked at the whitish-haired beauty and said slowly, "To think that there would come a day when you would say such bold words. I plan to become your #1 partner, was what you said, if I didn't hear wrong? Little Bingshui, you have grown up. As your big sister, I feel very proud of you." Shangguan Bingshui looked at her silently and a peculiar glint shone in her eyes. Suddenly, a faint smile appeared on her face as she said softly, "I wonder if you will still feel proud the day I take your seat as your biggest support." "Oh?" Lilith looked at her with interest, the smile on her face not wavering for a moment as she waited for her next words. "Bai Zemin said it before, didn't he? I have been his biggest physical support from the beginning until now. You can't do much in this aspect, can you?" Shangguan Bingshui continued to smile slightly as she looked at her and said with confidence, "Today, I am his biggest physical support, but who knows? Tomorrow it might not only be physical but also moral and mental. When that happens, what will your position really be? If I were you, I would feel ashamed to be the useless sweetheart of the man who has the greatest talent in history. Let's say, and I say let's say because it won't happen, but let's say that just as you claim you managed to become his greatest moral, mental, and physical support." Lilith nodded with an elegant smile before tilting her head slightly in a cute manner as she said in an innocent voice, "But, little Bingshui, I'll still be his girlfriend no matter how you look at it, nu? Meanwhile you, the big super mega cool support, will be a good friend? Who knows?" Shangguan Bingshui shook her head without being too bothered by Lilith's words. She smiled, and as she slightly narrowed her eyes her pupils glittered. "By choosing the frozen sacrilege succubus class, I'll stop being completely human when I reach the third order, won't I?" "Oh?" Lilith raised both eyebrows and the smile on her face grew as she nodded slightly. "I'm surprised you managed to figure out so much on your own. Despite knowing that you will no longer be 100% human, you have chosen to walk that path. And from what I can see, you did it partially to compete with me, didn't you? So, what's next? I admit that just as you said, part of the reason I chose to walk this path is to challenge you and beat you on your own field." Shangguan Bingshui nodded. "However, there is an even greater reason." Lilith's eyes glistened slightly and the smile on her face grew as she waited for Shangguan Bingshui's next words. "I'm not sure if what I feel for him is what I think it is. I'm inexperienced as this might be my first time, and honestly I'm also a little scared. However, if it is what I think it is, then it won't be necessary for me to continue hiding my true self anymore, will it?" Shangguan Bingshui softly pursed her lips. Her pupils dilated slightly and a haze of charm covered her blue eyes as she looked at Lilith with a face that was the 100% opposite of the word coldness. "Since there will be no need to pretend anymore, then I will give my 200% so that he can't take his eyes off me even for a second." Shangguan Bingshui's voice was a bit defiant as she looked at Lilith and said softly, "You know, since I was very young, I was always #1 in everything, especially when it comes to beauty. With a single wave of my hands, I could have left any woman without her love. This is a thought that never crossed my mind, until now." "Ha ha ha." Lilith laughed heartily upon hearing Shangguan Bingshui's words. However, what surprised Shangguan Bingshui was that Lilith's laughter did not sound mocking, but rather it was as if she was actually having a good time for some reason. She looked at Shangguan Bingshui with a big smile capable of driving any male crazy as she laughingly said, "This is really great. I've been challenged many times, you know, but in terms of beauty or charm, I'm afraid this might be the first time. Who knows, it might be your first time being challenged and defeated at the same time." Shangguan Bingshui smiled slightly and started walking towards the house. I guess you're ready to challenge Sissy Juan as well? Feeling Shangguan Bingshui's footsteps stopping behind, Lilith chuckled and said with a hint of disdain, "What's wrong? Don't tell me that this is as far as your determination goes? Well, and I thought it would be an interesting challenge for a moment." Such a disappointment. Lilith watched over her shoulder as Shangguan Bingshui's body trembled slightly. Her mood had gotten so out of control that the water in the pool had frozen and a thick layer of frost was building up around her. "You want to challenge me merely with this? You think because you chose a path similar to mine you're getting closer to me?" Lilith's voice turned a hint cold as she said these words leisurely. Her body swayed slightly and vanished, but her words still hovered in Shangguan Bingshui's ears for a few seconds even though she was no longer around. A little kid who has lost nothing and can afford to restrict her power for such a childish reason wants to defeat me? You're still 55 years too young, brat. Shangguan Bingshui's anger and embarrassment soon turned into confusion because of these last words. Unfortunately, there was nobody to clarify that doubt. Chapter 917 Family Harem, Part 1. Xietain naturally had no idea about the conversation Lilith and Shangguan Bingshui shared after he left the scene. It wasn't that he had run away from there by any means, but that he actually had something very important to do, and that was why he left when Lilith pointed out the practically fully dawned to him. Although he knew that the two women were definitely having some perhaps not so pleasant talk, there wasn't much Xietain could do about it. In fact, he still found it difficult, or rather, could not even figure out a concrete reason why Lilith and Shangguan Bingshui did not get along at all. From the very first moment, the two met on the now collapsed bridge linking the north and south of Beijing. The two women practically became enemies at first sight. Because of the lingering language problem, Xietain first went for Callie and put her on his back. After descending the stairs, he put her in her wheelchair before looking for Bai Shilin and carrying her on his back while moving the wheelchair out of the house. Since it was still very early, the number of people in the streets of the privileged area of the base was 0, so Xietain had no problem getting home with the two little girls who were still sleeping comfortably after they realized that he was the one who was moving them. Arriving at his parents' house, Xietain left Callie and Bai Shilin resting on the two big couches in the living room before walking to the kitchen. As he walked through the corners of this house that he thought would take time to get used to calling home, for some reason he felt nostalgic as if he had lived there for his entire life even though he had actually only spent a few nights in this place. "All right," he muttered before getting down to business. Xietain was not the best chef in the world, let alone the universe. In fact, he would most likely never become one. Princess Bianca of the Lidora Kingdom back in Eventide World was at least 100 times better than him or anyone he had ever met when it came to the field of cooking. However, he wasn't bad. His family's house had everything he needed, but Xietain only used the seasonings since he had higher quality ingredients in his storage ring. Just as he was taking out some vegetables he gathered at Eventide World during the week he was away from the castle while the competition of kingdoms was taking place, the sound of small footsteps behind him followed by Bai Shilin's voice made him turn around to see the girl, rubbing her eyes. "Father, breakfast?" "Yup, I'll prepare breakfast today." "Shilin want to eat the food made by Dad?" Bai Shilin nodded, still somewhat sleepy since she hadn't slept much. Xietain told the girl to go back to rest, but she shook her head and said she wanted to stay with him, and so he let her do whatever she wanted. Despite the 9 to 10-year-old appearance that the current Bai Shilin had, the reality was that she was only a 7-month-old newborn. Of course, because she had a large amount of Weaver Ant records, her growth speed was unmatched, and the fact that she is a powerful soul evolver made it no problem not to sleep for a couple of days. It wasn't more than a few minutes later before the girl began to help Xietain with the cooking. While she washed the vegetables and handed them to him, Xietain chopped them at the same time as Bai Shilin washed the rice in a pot. Watching Bai Shilin smiling happily while humming some kind of unfamiliar song, Xietain felt a surprisingly strong surge of relief in his heart. He couldn't help but wonder if his paternal instincts had kicked in, and by seeing his daughter being happy his worries suddenly became less heavy. Although the noise the two of them were making was minimal, as Bai Zemin had told Bai Shilin to be careful not to wake the others, Bai Dilan and Meng Qi were second-order soul evolvers, so it was impossible for them not to wake up eventually. By the time Bai Zemin was marinating the meat of a third-order mutant bull, the sound of heavy footsteps made him force a wry smile as he continued his task. Bai Dilan awoke alert, but his alertness soon turned to confusion when he realized the sound was coming from the kitchen. Since his wife was sleeping next to him, the other person was probably his daughter Meng Qi, but that didn't make much sense either, since they usually all woke up about another hour or so later. It was obvious that it couldn't be a thief, let alone a killer, so Bai Dilan was careful not to wake Yilinger and got out of bed. His expression became even weirder when he saw the beautiful little sickly-looking doll sleeping peacefully on one of the couches, but after looking at her for a few seconds he headed for the kitchen without hiding his presence. He could feel Bai Shilin giggling happily as the kitchen utensils formed their own melody. When Bai Dilan arrived at the kitchen entrance and saw the back of the grown man who seemed to be educating the girl regarding the arts of cooking, he froze for an instant before his pupils trembled fiercely. He would recognize that back even on his deathbed. This person was his son after all. Even if Bai Zemin was already a grown man, to Bai Dilan and to Yilinger he would probably still be the same child who needed to be cared for and protected. Bai Zemin looked at his father over his shoulder and smiled slightly as he said calmly, "Old man, you go to the living room and wait. This time I will be the family chef for this morning." Bai Dilan looked into his son's blood-colored eyes for a few seconds. He said practically nothing, asked no questions or anything similar. There were only a few words that came from his heart. "Good job in coming back." Bai Zemin nodded before returning to his task. He and his father were like that, though the two did not say how much they loved each other in words. They both knew that either of them was more than willing to lay down their lives for the other. "Father, what about Shilin?" Shilin was the one who prepared the vegetables and rice, wasn't she? "Of course, my precious girl is the main chef. Father wouldn't be able to prepare such a yummy breakfast if it weren't for your magic hands." Ahem. Bai Dilan smiled and his eyes filled with tears at the sight in front of him. He wrinkled his nose and forced those tears back the way they came before walking into the living room and sitting on the couch opposite the one Callie was using as a bed. Not long after, Meng Qi walked downstairs as well, wearing loose, comfortable sleeping clothes. Her dark eyes flashed with confusion when she saw Bai Dilan sitting on the couch in the living room, but that confusion soon turned to perplexity when she saw the girl sleeping on the opposite couch. Bai Dilan motioned for her to be quiet and Meng Qi nodded before walking towards the kitchen in search of a glass of water, thinking that her mother was there along with Bai Shilin. However, her movements froze when she saw that far from her mother, the person standing there was her brother, the person she had wanted to see the most during this half year, the person she had cared about the most during the past few months, and the reason she had been working so hard to level up. Bai Zemin watched with a gentle smile as his younger sister's eyes filled with tears that fell down her face, soundlessly. Meng Qi's face crumpled and before her brother could say anything she practically teleported in front of him and hugged him so tightly that she almost knocked him to the ground after being taken by surprise. Bai Zemin's eyes trembled slightly as he listened to Meng Qi's disconsolate crying and his heart squeezed tightly. Subconsciously, he hugged her back and as he caressed her back carefully, Bai Zemin swallowed his words. This was the second time Bai Zemin saw Meng Qi crying so disconsolately like a small child after she stepped into adolescence and learned to live with the death of her birth parents. The first time was when Bai Zemin almost collapsed after learning the truth about Feng Tianwu and Sun Jie, but at that time she was crying on the sly and Bai Zemin only caught her by pure coincidence. Meng Qi had not even cried like this after meeting with Bai Zemin after several months following the outbreak of the apocalypse, but now she was crying so loudly that their mother should definitely have felt it from the upper floor. Bai Zemin's face turned slightly pale and his heart finally began to feel fear as far from calming down Meng Qi's crying was getting worse and worse to the point where she was starting to have trouble catching her breath, while her arms and hands tried to hug him closer and desperately moved around his back. Feeling panic in his heart and not knowing what more to do, Xietain hugged her tightly and whispered in her ear just like an adult caring for a baby as he slowly let them both slide down to their knees on the ground. Bai Shilin didn't know what was happening, so she looked with panic at the scene of her aunt crying and her father trying to calm her down. She looked around for help before running while calling out for her grandpa. In the living room, Bai Dilan sighed as he said to Bai Shilin that everything was okay and gently pulled the girl to sit beside him. He didn't go to the kitchen but waited as he listened to his daughter's crying and his son's words that didn't seem to have much effect. This time had been different after all. Unlike when the apocalypse broke out where the family could tell each other that Xietain had definitely not turned into a zombie and was fine, the current reality was that he was attacked by a nuclear missile and to save other people's lives he had taken that nuclear missile to some distant world. That missile had definitely exploded in the other world. Was Xietain able to survive it? According to Evangeline and the rest of Xietan's loyal followers, he was alive. However, no one really knew. Xietain was thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, countless light years away from Earth. Would he be able to come back? According to Shangguan Bing Shui, who knew of his title, he should be able to return, yes. But, when? No one really knew. Under so much pressure, the whole family was on the verge of collapse and the only reason they were able to endure was because the three of them were together and thanks to Shangguan Bing Shui never ordered them to move on a mission even though Bai Dilan and Meng Qi's strength were certainly crucial. Now that Xietain had returned safe and sound, Bai Dilan had been able to endure since he was a man of the old school and would cry in some corner when no one was paying attention to him. However, Meng Qi was different. Even she who was surprisingly mature for her age could not help but break down. As Bai Dilan calmed Bai Shilin that was looking towards the kitchen anxiously, he noticed the snow-white-haired girl on the opposite couch wriggling and pushing with her hands to sit up. "Ah, it looks like Meng Qi's crying woke you up." "Sorry for that." Bai Dilan tried to engage in conversation with kindness. This sickly-looking little girl had been brought home by his son after all, so the two of them were probably close. As to how they met, Bai Dilan had no idea. Callie turned in Bai Dilan's direction and after a moment said something that neither he nor Bai Shilin understood. Bai Dilan didn't know what to do as he realized the language barrier, but unfortunately for him the girl just stood there silently as she kept her eyes closed and with her focus on Bai Shilin who was looking at her curiously. Chapter 918 Family Harem, Part 2 of 2. It was absolutely impossible that with how loudly and desperately Meng Qi was crying not to wake up whoever was sleeping upstairs. Therefore, a series of footsteps soon began to be heard. Yilinger's face was almost as pale as that of a person who had just seen a ghost while rushing down the stairs. When she descended the last step and found her husband sitting on the couch with Bai Shilin sitting on his lap, her expression calmed down a bit. However, she was still so agitated that she didn't even notice Callie sitting quietly there. "Old man, what's happening in the kitchen?" She started walking towards the kitchen as she asked aloud. "Linger, wait Bai Dilan sighed before standing up as she ignored him and ran towards the kitchen frantically. It wasn't until more than 20 minutes later that Xietain managed to calm down a bit, not only his younger sister but also his mother, who when she saw him nearly collapsed before running and joining her children on the ground, crying as she thanked the gods for returning her son to her and not tearing her family apart. In the end, although he managed to convince his mother to let him prepare breakfast, Yilinger sat next to Meng Qi at the kitchen counter while they watched him cook. After about 30 minutes, Xietain had finished preparing 3 simple dishes consisting of rice, meat, vegetables. With help from his sister and mother, soon everyone found themselves sitting at the table and before anyone could say anything, Callie tugged on his clothes to get his attention. "Bullet, after breakfast I need you to give me the pendant Seraphina's father gave you." Xietain's eyes shone slightly as he asked quickly, Will you modify it to understand the languages of this world? Okay. Callie nodded before she began to eat in silence. Bai Sherlin leaned forward slightly and looked at Callie, who was sitting on the opposite side of Bai Zemin, as she asked in a low voice, "Hey, Dad. Who is this little sister?" Sherlin doesn't understand anything she says. Little sister? Bai Zemin looked at Bai Sherlin at a loss for words. My precious Sherlin, she is actually bigger than you, so you should call her big sister instead of little sister, even though she is so short and needs to be carried. Sherlin can walk and doesn't need Dad to carry her. Also, why does she always have her eyes closed? Is she very sleepy? Sherlin can borrow her bed to rest. Bai Zemin smiled wryly at his daughter's innocence and while stroking her hair slowly tried to explain, Sherlin, her name is Callie. Callie can't walk because she has a very bad disease in her body, and that bad disease won't let her open her eyes either. Do you understand? She is a person Dad liked very much, because while Dad was away Callie helped me a lot. So I hope you will be kind to her, can you do that? Oh. Bai Sherlin made a small sound as if she understood but at the same time doesn't understand. She secretly looked at Callie and finally nodded, okay. Sherlin will be kind to big sister Callie seeing that she helped Sherlin's father. Bai Zemin smiled gently and added, also, Sherlin, remember not to tell Callie what you just said about her not being able to walk or see, okay? She might get sad. Okay. Bai Delan smiled slightly as he said calmly, to think that not long ago you were an impertinent brat. But look at you now, caring for and raising your own daughter. Bai Zemin chuckled as he patted Bai Sherlin on the head, much to the delight of the girl who closed her eyes like a cat. Meng Qi was a little embarrassed after her earlier behavior, so she without saying anything cut a small piece of meat using her chopsticks and put it in her mouth. You have received stamina 19, strength 25. Meng Qi's eyes lit up from the taste of the meat but the shock was mainly from the increase in stats. She looked at Bai Zemin and stammered an incomplete question, "The big brother, this meat." Bai Zemin looked at her with a faint smile and said calmly, "That meat is from a big third-order cow I killed in the other world." He looked at his mother, but just as he was about to say something the first thing Bai Zemin noticed was how, although she looked way younger than before his mother, Xietain still had a lock or two of whitish hair. Before I leave I should put that plan into action. Bai Zemin's expression did not change, but in his heart, he had already made up his mind. Mom, you should eat too. But you can't eat the meat alone like Meng Qi just did because your body is too weak. You should accompany the meat with that red vegetable. That vegetable serves to store large amounts of energy and help you digest it little by little. Xietain nodded, but even while eating her eyes were permanently fixed on her son's body. She even ignored the messages flashing in her eyes and seemed to be willing to push away even the tiniest speck of dust floating in the air and disturbing her little prince. Zemin, regarding your eyes. Bai Delan hesitated as to whether or not he should continue, so he paused and looked at his son as he asked, trying to keep calm, "Is everything all right?" "It's everything fine, father. This is just a skill of mine that occasionally kicks in." Bai Zemin smiled and told them not to worry. He didn't lie, but he didn't tell the truth either. This was an important moment for everyone after all. As they ate their meal now calmer, Meng Qi, who had managed to stabilize her mood a bit, asked, "Big brother, were you really in another world?" Bai Zemin nodded and calmly said, "As you already know, after Xinyuan Wendian launched a nuclear missile I tried to find a way to counter it. But it's not that easy to take down a weapon capable of killing fourth-order existences. After crossing the portal to the other world I managed to get out of the range of the explosion and radiation, but the cost was falling unconscious for a week due to the use of a skill that boosts my stats exaggeratedly." Bai Zemin put down his utensils and looked at Bai Sherlin as he said with a gentle smile, "Sherlin, do you want to hear a story about another world? A world full of powerful beings, princesses, princes, kings, queens, demons, and many exciting things." Bai Sherlin didn't even think about it and nodded intently while chewing her food with her sharp teeth. Xietain looked at his father, mother, and younger sister. After a short pause, he began to narrate his life over the past nearly 6 months. The world I was transported to is called Eventide World. 2 hours passed, and during those 2 hours, Xietain made sure to paint a large and considerably detailed picture of his life in Eventide World with his words. Xietain looked at her son with surprise after he stopped. Xietain, you really did all that in just 6 months? Not 6 months, Mom. Xietain shook his head and pointed. I was 2 months unconscious, you forget? My battle against the Demon Lord was really hard, and a big part of that victory is due to Callie actually sitting by my side. Otherwise, I'm afraid things would have gotten complicated for me. It was thanks to Callie that Xietain learned soul manipulation, and it was thanks to her that he got his grand sword upgraded. These 2 fateful trap cards were undoubtedly the most important in his fight against Argon, and without them Xietain would definitely not have been so sure of his victory against the fully unleashed Demon Lord. After hearing the whole story, the way the family looked at Callie was completely different. To them, the 14-year-old girl was practically a heroine to whom they owed everything. Meeting a princess, invocations, betrayals, becoming the hero of a kingdom, opposing the whole world, killing legends, becoming a legend, fighting against armies of demons, becoming the human hero who fought and after a fierce battle defeated the terrifying demon lord who had terrorized the human race for so long. Were it not for the fact that you are my son and I know you better than anyone else, I fear it would be hard for me to believe what I just heard. Xietain put down his chopsticks and sighed as he looked at his son with a complicated expression. Really, this all sounds like a fairy tale, something out of a fantasy. Mengqi nodded. However, she seemed interested in something else as she soon asked, casually, by the way, big brother, this princess Seraphina D. Gales was her name? What happened to her after she learned that her fate eyes don't show her a 100% safe fate? Xietain chuckled as the image of the second princess of the Gales kingdom appeared in his mind. She is fine, despite being young she is a very strong girl. Seraphina D. Gales is, in fact, the strongest girl I have ever met in my entire life. She lost her mother, she lost her friends, she was betrayed by her sister. The ocular skill she blindly trusted turned out not to be absolute. Callie left, Xietain left. All in less than 6 months. She won't fall. Xietain said confidently. We will definitely meet again, and when she really needs me, I will definitely be there. I'm sure that when the time comes she will have become a powerful third-order soul evolver and her name will be known far and wide in Eventide World. Mengqi looked at him and subconsciously her index finger began to gently tap on the table while saying with both eyebrows raised, Big brother, from the way you talk about her it wouldn't seem strange to me if the prophecy of that princess, what's her name's eyes ends up coming true. What do you think? Was Seraphina's name so hard to remember or mention? Because Xietain didn't think so. On the other hand, Xietan's eyes lit up as she looked at Xietain with excitement. She took her daughter's hands and began to express her thoughts. This girl, Seraphina D. Gales, has the blood of a noble family of a great legacy in her veins, right? An educated, classy, talented girl with the title of princess of a great kingdom. Xietain, although Mom has yet to meet her to give the final vote, I am 90% sure she will be a good addition to your harem. Xietain nearly choked to death with the piece of meat he was chowing down on and hurriedly began to drink water. After his life was out of danger, he patted his chest in fright and looked at his mother in shock. Talented, noble blood, princess title, so far everything was fine. However, classy? Xietain winced at the memory of Seraphina's blonde ponytails flying all over the place as she pointed her finger at him and yelled orc this and orc that. To everyone's surprise, however, he didn't renege on the harem matter this time but instead asked a curious question. Mother, you seem to be fine with one man having many wives? Well, you are on the point of becoming the king of the new China, aren't you? What king doesn't have 1 or 2 wives and 10 or 15 concubines? Xietain, you are this strong and even in other worlds you are considered a hero by all humans. So what's bad about you having some loving girls? To everyone's surprise, Xietain nodded. I see, it makes sense. Xietinger's eyes shone like stars in the night sky, but before she could say anything else, her son stepped in front of her. In that case, mother, what about father? Your father? What does your father have to do with all this? Xietain wiped his mouth with a napkin and didn't seem to notice the slight change in his mother's voice as he calmly said, well, Dad is the father of the future king of China, isn't he? Besides, he is a second-order soul evolver who will eventually break into the third order, so he is powerful and even looks handsome thanks to his soul power. Xietinger's expression was not good as she slowly asked, Xietain, what do you mean? Be clear with Mom. Xietain ignored his father's signals and continued, under my rule, as long as one has the strength and ability to feed their willing partners, polygamy is not frowned upon regardless of whether it is male or female. Therefore, I think Dad could also have his own harem. What do you think, Mom? Xieitinger looked at Xietain with a serious expression and said in a firm voice, as long as it is under my roof, who is in charge here is me. The same applies to you, are we clear? Of course, of course. Xietain raised both hands and nodded innocently. Xieitinger switched her attention to Bai Dilan, who was squirming uncomfortably in his seat, and opened her eyes wide as she raised her voice a little, and you, old thing. Are you still not rejecting such an indecent proposal? You are already this old, but are you still thinking about perverted matters? But, mother. Dad looks young and, Xietain, keep your mouth quiet. Yes, ma'am. Dilan, we need to talk. Xieitinger stood up and walked toward the stairs as she said in a serious voice, Princess, Xietain, you two clear the table and wash the dishes. This, linger I. Upstairs. Bai Dilan gave a wry smile as he stood up silently. Before he left, however, he motioned to Xietain with an open palm as if telling him to get his butt ready. Xietain pretended to tremble in fear as he watched with a big smile on his face as he walked away. Big brother, you're really mean. Meng Qi covered her mouth and giggled under her breath. The smile on Xietin's face slowly receded, and after a few seconds of silence, he calmly said, Meng Qi, we have to get Mom to start evolving. She doesn't need to be strong, we just need to let her gain soul power on a regular basis and gradually level up. I'll help you. Meng Qi nodded with a serious expression. She had also noticed the obvious difference between her mother and father after all. Although no one said anything since Xieitinger was protected by everyone, it was inevitable to receive some weird glances since she looked like a 35 to 40 years old woman dating a young man in his 20s. Of course, what really mattered to Xietain and Meng Qi was that neither of them wanted their mother to die of old age. Therefore, they had to find a way to make her evolve of her own free will. Xietain rubbed his chin as a funny and torturous plan shaped in his mind. He secretly scrubbed his hands together as he laughed like a little devil, hoping to see a good game. Chapter 919 Reward for Xietain. Xietain spent the whole morning with his family before telling his father and sister that past noon he would be holding an important meeting regarding the future actions of the Transcendent faction, so they both had the qualifications to attend given their status. Of course, Xieitinger also wanted to participate, but Xietain told her that unfortunately she could not since even if she was his mother and had certain privileges compared to other people, Xietain could not break his own rules so blatantly. Although his mother was not happy to let him go so soon, she knew that there was not much choice in the matter. At the end of the day, Xietain was destined to walk down a path filled with difficulties that needed to be stepped on with steady and firm steps, because stopping would mean his downfall. This was something Xieitinger naturally did not wish to see even in her nightmares. Don't worry, Mom. Xietain kissed his mother's forehead and said with a smile, I'll be back in time for dinner and we'll spend the night here. Besides, I won't come alone, so be sure to prepare some more food. You will bring many people? Xieitinger asked with some hesitation. Xietain chuckled and shook his head. Nope. Okay then. She nodded before standing on her tiptoes as she made Bai Zemin lean down to kiss his forehead. Go carefully. Don't worry. Bai Zemin nodded, and as he held Bai Shirleen's right hand, he gently pushed Callie's wheelchair with his free hand. He had barely set foot on the sidewalk street when a beautiful woman around 30 to 32 years old, wearing a lot of jewelry and a slightly too low-cut dress, who was walking a dog, was stunned for a moment because of his appearance. However, when the woman's eyes met Bai Zemin's blood-red eyes, all the blood drained from her face and backed away in fright as her legs trembled. Bai Zemin shook his head and without a word continued on his way. There were several people who were frightened, and Bai Zemin was stopped by some teams of soul evolvers who were sent to see what was going on. This was the privileged area of the base after all. Nothing bad had to happen behind these walls or it would be a disaster. Isn't she the little princess? A female soul evolver noticed Bai Shirlin, who was holding Bai Zemin's hand, and her eyes flashed with surprise. Little princess? Bai Zemin looked sideways at Bai Shirlin and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seems that Bing Shui has taken Shirlin to many meetings during this time. When the eyes of the others fell on Bai Shirlin, the expression of most of them changed slightly. One of them, who seemed to be the leader of this team, took a step forward and looked Bai Zemin up and down before asking in a slightly respectful voice, "Excuse me, may I know your name?" Bai Zemin didn't have time to say any words when Bai Shirlin stepped forward. "He is Shirleen's father." "Your father?" The group leader looked at Bai Shirlin in astonishment, but as the meaning of these words began to become clear in his head, his face turned stiffly in Bai Zemin's direction. "My name is Bai Zemin." Bai Zemin. Isn't that the name of the leader? The leader of the group of 5 soul evolvers bowed deeply and said in a trembling voice, "A leader, Bai. I am sorry for the offense. Our group was only fulfilling its function. It's all right, I understand." Bai Zemin nodded and before continuing on his way he told the team to continue with the good work. Honestly, Bai Zemin was very satisfied with what had just happened. No one tried to bully him, no one was rude, and everyone simply did the job they were supposed to do. As the group of soul evolvers watched Bai Zemin carrying the 2 girls and disappearing after turning a corner, one of them cursed under his breath. "Damn, do the higher-ups want to kill us or what? To think they would send us to give trouble to the highest leader, but the leader is really different, don't you think? From the very beginning I felt like someone was choking me just by being near him. Well, it's not for nothing that he's the founding leader of our transcendent faction. From normal student to future ruler of China, all in 1 year. Our leader's life really is like a legend." The team leader sighed and shook his head as he turned around. "Guys, let's get on with our duties." They were respected soul evolvers that in the eyes of normal survivors were no different from gods with powerful divine skills. However, compared to true divine existences, they knew they were nothing worth mentioning. "Bullet, you don't need to come pick me up today." Those were the first words Callie said to Bai Zemin once he took the 2 girls to his workshop located in the western part of the base where all kinds of factories had been built. "What?" Bai Zemin looked at her in surprise as he took out his forging tools and carefully organized them. "I'll be modifying the runes of the earring after all," Callie pointed out with a serene expression on her face. "Although it won't be an earring meant for combat, what I will be doing with this earring is not something simple enough, so it will take me at least 2 days. It's out of the question." Bai Zemin shook his head and said in a serious voice, "I will come to pick you up when the sun sets. Tonight we'll have dinner together at my house, you'll sleep in a bed, and in the morning I'll bring you here so you can continue working calmly for the rest of the day." "But Callie." The girl trembled in her wheelchair and her back became rigid as she looked in Bai Zemin's direction. The expression on her usually indifferent face turned into one of shock as she waited in silence. Bai Zemin stared at her and said in a serious voice, "It's good to work hard and all, but you must not forget that you are not a robot. You, Callie, are a 14-year-old girl. You are my friend and a precious existence to me. If you want to follow me, then you will have to adhere to nights of sleep and at least 1 meal a day. Is that clear to you?" Callie subconsciously nodded twice, and seeing her face slightly paler than usual, Xietain wondered if he had been a little too hard on her. He sighed and reached out to her to stroke her pure white hair as he said in a softer voice, "Look, I know you're used to living alone. However, you are no longer by yourself. You, Callie, are a precious and necessary existence of mine. Therefore, I hope you can have a dignified and warm life, not an emotionless and cold one where you move rigidly." Without waiting for a response from her side, Xietain asked Bai Sherlin to stay to keep her company and left some food on the table so that the two girls would have something to eat in case they felt hungry. After taking off the earring and putting it in Callie's small hand, he turned and left. Callie only came out of her daze about a minute later, and as Bai Sherlin looked at her curiously, she mumbled something that the future Ant Queen did not understand before getting to work. After leaving the workshop, Xietain put a cloak back on to cover his face in order to avoid scaring all the survivors in the base before heading towards the hotel where the American Soul Evolvers were staying. His footsteps stopped after a few minutes when he saw a familiar person sitting in a restaurant. He was enjoying a cup of coffee while looking off into the distance with a thoughtful expression on his face. When Xietain approached him, this person felt it immediately and turned in his direction saying with a faint smile, "What a surprise, I didn't expect to meet you here." "It's still a while before the meeting, isn't it?" Xietain sat on the chair in front of Chen He and nodded. "It's still about 2 hours before the meeting, don't worry." "By the way, what are you doing here?" Chen He pointed to the cup of coffee in front of him and asked, "What about you?" "I just dropped Callie off at my workshop. She will modify an accessory to be able to understand our language." "Callie?" "Oh, the little girl from the world you went to." The two were silent before Chen He asked, "What do you plan to do now?" "I'm going to go meet Angelo and his team." Xietain stood up with the intention of leaving as he commented, "They will return to the United States today as they cannot afford to be away from home during wartime. Besides, as you well know, Angelo will want to exchange information with me, so getting a few hours ahead of schedule won't hurt anyone. In that case, let me accompany you." Chen He stood up and took out a red-colored ticket. After putting the red ticket under the almost completely finished cup of coffee, he smiled slightly and asked, "Let's go?" Xietain said nothing, and after pulling down the hood covering his face one more time he simply turned to leave. Chen He followed closely behind him, not knowing whether to laugh or cry as he heard the people murmuring and the women looking at him with shining eyes. Sitting in the spacious living room of the hotel where Angelo and his team were staying, Xietain settled on the couch as he took off his hood and looked at the group of 3 sitting on the opposite seat. "What do you think about the base?" "Sorry, I couldn't give you a tour personally as unfortunately my faction has some problems in the north that I need to solve personally." Xietain began to talk with a slight smile and without rushing to get into the subject at hand. Angelo looked at Xietain in silence for a moment before sighing. "Xietain, as you already well know, my father was the President of the United States. My education was very varied, and among those fields were leadership, business, psychology, and many other fields intended to make me outstanding in leading and understanding people. However, I must admit that this base of your faction has a much higher level of civilian security than I thought, and is even comparable to that of my faction's main base. No offense, but I didn't expect much from you in this field since you used to be a normal student." Eleonora looked at Xietain in a new light as well, since she was genuinely surprised. Even Angelo had admitted this morning that he had learned 2 or 3 things that he would implement after returning and taking back Dallas. Nothing to be offended about, Xietain simply sighed and pointed out, "To be frankly honest, my job was to set the rules and show everyone the consequences of breaking those rules during the first few months of the apocalypse. However, if we are talking about government and order, then the one who deserves to be commended is the granddaughter of the former Prime Minister of China. If I'm not wrong, the little princess of the Wu family is named Wu Yijun?" Angelo smiled slightly and said in a joking tone, "That girl clearly has a lot more affection for you than ordinary. I'm sure she will be very happy if you show her your appreciation." Xietain froze upon hearing Angelo's words, and a somewhat awkward expression momentarily crossed his face. Chen He, who was sitting next to him, chuckled and after a brief silence remarked, "I think he has a good point, Xietain. Besides, Xietain rejects any advances from any man on a daily basis, you know? There even appeared several talents in other bases who expressed their interest in her, but she didn't even give them a glance. I'm not saying take her as a partner, but at least spend some time with her as friends. It shouldn't be bad, or should it?" Chen He's words definitely had several valid points, and hearing it Xietain couldn't help but fall into deep contemplation for a moment. The world had changed, this was an irrefutable fact. However, the way friends behaved had to change as well. Wu Yijun had repeatedly proven to be absolutely loyal to Xietain to the point where the girl had even decided to go against her family to follow in his steps. One needed to remember that Wu Yijun's relationship with her family in the government was very good, unlike Shangguan Bing Shui, who practically detested the previous government. I guess that a friendly outing should be fine. Xietain nodded. However, he first needed to consult this with Lilith and would then discuss it with Wu Yijun, but he would make things clear to her from the start to avoid hurting her with false hopes. Chen He patted his shoulder and said with a smile, "That's good. I think everyone in the faction agrees that Yijun deserves at least a reward, and I'm sure she will be happy if that reward comes from you." Chapter 920 Berserker Serum L. Xietain continued chatting about trivial matters with Angelo, completely ignoring Eleonora to the point where the girl looked like she was about to spit flames out of her mouth, so eventually she ignored him too and started chatting with Chen He and Dylan. After about 30 to 40 minutes, Xietain decided it was about time, so he stood up and calmly said, "I'm sorry to be impolite, but I'm afraid we'll have to take our leave for now. An important meeting is coming up and I need to be there to lead the faction. Angelo, it is a pleasure to have met you, and I feel fortunate that I did not run into a racist or supremacist in America. I will escort you to the airstrip." His words subtly indicated that the group of three had to leave the base. Although it was a bit impolite, the truth was that Xietain had made it clear yesterday upon arrival that they could not stay long for obvious reasons. Besides, Angelo had also agreed to leave before noon and the time was approaching the agreed time. Eleonora and Dylan looked at Angelo silently, but their eyes seemed to suggest something. Finally, Angelo looked at Xietain and instead of standing up he said in a serious voice, "Xietain, I would like to establish an official alliance with you." "Oh?" Xietain raised an eyebrow pretending surprise. He hesitated as if he knew nothing of what Angelo was saying before slowly sitting down and asking in a serious voice, "You just said that you would like to form an official alliance, but with me? Let me explain." Angelo nodded, and after settling his thoughts, he continued, "Everyone in this room is a responsible adult person, so I won't beat around the bush and will be blunt. Is that okay with you?" Xietain subconsciously looked at Eleonora and said slowly, "Let's assume that everyone here is a responsible adult then. Go on. You." Eleonora looked at Xietain with wide eyes and gritted her teeth when she was ignored. She gasped in indignation and asked Chen He, "Hey, is this guy always this annoying? I swear to God, in my country he would have been beaten up by now." Chen He smiled wryly and pointed out in a low voice, "I'm afraid that in our faction not a few people want to beat him up, and I include myself among them, but wanting to and being able to are two different things." "Oh? You want to beat him up too?" Eleonora's eyes sparkled, and after looking at Chen He for a few seconds she nodded, "I like you. Tell me more." On the other hand, Angelo and Xietain continued to chat with each other. "Xietain, you are powerful and you proved it when you battled that strange monster. To reach a power level equal to yours I would first have to activate my strongest skill and the cost would not be small at all," Angelo pointed out in a deep voice. "However, being strong is not enough for me to propose an alliance with you. It wasn't until after seeing the situation of this establishment that I came to the conclusion that you and I can make a good front for our human race. Xietain did not reveal that he already knew the real reason why Angelo was proposing an alliance to him and, instead, pretended that he believed his words. I see. He nodded and said in a serious voice, our human race is on the verge of extinction, so if possible I hope not to have to fight against my kind. And I agree that we need to stand together given the circumstances. However, Angelo, forming an alliance between you and me? I don't think it would be of much help, don't you think? Well, it is true that due to the long distance that separates us an alliance is not of much use except for certain key circumstances. However, there are other ways to support each other without being physically present. There is a method in which no one loses anything, only gains for you and me that will not only help us fight against the other races, but also help us reaffirm our dominance over our respective territories and citizens. Xieitain's eyes narrowed and he said quietly, continue. Honestly, Xietain and Chen, he already knew what Angelo was about to propose thanks to Evangeline. However, the reason why the two of them pretended that they didn't know anything about it was because they didn't want the American team to know that they had already learned about Eleonora's mind-reading skill. Besides, while it was true that Xietain and Chen he were feigning ignorance, the truth was that Angelo's proposal was of great interest to the entire faction. Exchange of information and technology, Angelo said in a deep voice. Xietain, I'm sure your faction has found ruins left behind from ancient times too, haven't you? That's why you've managed to expand so fast, just like me and my faction, right? Xietain did not bother to clarify Angelo's misunderstanding regarding the speed of his faction's expansion. He didn't need to explain that the main reason for their fast expansion was because 80% of his faction's soul evolvers were existences whose soul power was purer than average, so they could step on a few levels when fighting. He did not need to explain that the main reason for their fast expansion was that thanks to his fussy soul, his faction had thousands of treasures and skill scrolls to nurture powerful fighters. Instead, Xietain continued to play to the tune of the leader of the United States of America. Angelo, you just said too, so that means you have found that kind of ruins, am I right? Angelo nodded without hiding anything and said slowly, about 5 months ago, a team of explorers encountered a weird group of sea beasts near the shores of Chicago, for which I was immediately notified of this fact. Upon arriving to the scene, the first thing my team and I noticed was that these sea beasts were being led by intelligent beings. Therefore, we decided to continue observing in an attempt to discover what might attract the attention of these beasts to land, even at the cost of losing some of their power after leaving the waters. It turned out that these beasts started digging in the earth near the shore for a full week before entering a large tunnel that appeared underground. My team and I followed them from afar while using a treasure to hide our presence. Angelo paused and said in a deep voice, Xietain, those sea creatures were really powerful. They fought against all kinds of strange beasts that were underground. Among these beasts that lived subway, there were even more than 23rd order beasts. It may not seem like a very big deal now, but I think you can also understand what 23rd order soul evolvers represented half a year ago. Xietain nodded silently, his expression was serious and thoughtful. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that these sea creatures were seriously wounded after fighting the last obstacle, my team and I would have had to stand back. Angelo said with a sigh as if he was reminiscing about the past. Eleonora and Dylan nodded with serious expressions on their faces. Do you remember the space lock that obstructed your teleportation skills? Angelo asked suddenly, to which Xietain nodded. That's one of the technologies we found there, but I'm afraid I can't share this with you. However, I do have something that will surely be of interest to you and will definitely serve to boost the strength of your soldiers to the point of decreasing future deaths to a historic low for your faction. Saying that, Angelo opened the laptop computer on the small glass table and inserted a flash drive he brought on a necklace around his neck. Xietain and Chen, he watched as Angelo typed a few things into the computer before turning the screen towards them. When he pressed the enter button, a video started playing. The scene was being recorded at what looked like the entrance to a village. In front of a thin, weak-looking man was a horde of approximately 2,000 zombies running towards him grunting terrifyingly as pieces of rotting flesh and skin fell to the ground while stepping over each other to get to the food. The person recording seemed to say something as the thin man turned slightly to face the camera and nodded with some panic in his eyes. As Xietain and Xietain narrowed their eyes at the sight of the man pulling a syringe from his pants pocket, Angelo explained what was happening. The person you are seeing was a rapist who was going to be executed that very day, but in the end it was decided to use him as a guinea pig to test the Berserker Serum L. Under Xietain and Xiein's surprised eyes, a thick layer of golden-colored fur suddenly began to cover the man's body after he injected the liquid from inside the syringe. The man's body grew to 2 meters and his previously slender body became far more robust and, upon seeing the zombies less than 50 meters ahead, he rushed forward at a speed comparable to that of a first-order soul evolver. Flesh and blood flew everywhere as the beast man began to rip off the heads of the zombies and hit them with punches that shredded their bodies. There were many zombies that scratched the beastman's body, but the claws of the creatures failed to pierce the golden fur as there was not even a drop of blood coming from where there should have been wounds caused by the scratches. Angelo put the video on fast forward, and while for them only 5 minutes had passed, the video showed that it had been about 20 to 30 minutes when the last of the zombies fell lifeless under the big hands of the beast man. Xietan's expression was serious as he took his eyes off the screen and looked at Angelo. What he had just watched was an ordinary person with no soul power suddenly becoming powerful enough to crush a small army of 2,000 zombies. This was not something that could be ignored. If Xietain could get his hands on that serum, the number of human casualties during the conversion process between human and soul evolver would be significantly lower, not to mention that the soul power quality of future soul evolvers would be higher since they would start hunting higher level enemies without the help of another existence. Angelo noticed the interest in Xietan's eyes, and after putting the flash drive inside his clothes, he smiled slightly. This Berserker Serum L was developed following a formula we found in the ancient ruins. The ingredients are a bit troublesome to obtain, but for a large faction like yours it shouldn't be a problem. However, there are 2 drawbacks with this serum. What might these drawbacks be? The first drawback is that it only lasts for 1 hour, and before it can be used again by the same person it is necessary to wait 24 hours, or else there is a risk of mutation with no way back. Xietain nodded calmly. This first inconvenience was nothing for him who had the unlimited pagoda that allowed him to return the modified base records to their birth cradle. The second drawback is the most painful, since for as long as the effect of the Berserker Serum L is latent, it will cause the consumer to be in a state where it will seek battle, and if it does not find enemies it could get out of control and attack allies. Angelo said in a serious voice. Xietain frowned slightly as this was indeed a bigger problem. However, it was also not big enough to give headaches as long as the serum was used when the number of enemies was sufficient to avoid potential problems. Although Xietain was sure that Angelo had already found or had a way to avoid this second drawback, he did not say anything about it since it would be pointless to do so. After all, it was natural for Angelo to hold back a little. Besides, it wasn't as if Xietain wasn't thinking of doing the same thing anyway. What do you want in exchange for that serum? Xietain asked after a moment of silence. Technology, or something whose value is comparable to that of the Berserker Serum L. Angelo said in a deep voice and continued, Xietain, I'm sure you too understand the value of this serum. For us who have millions of people under our command, to possess this serum is no different than having the ability to mobilize millions of soldiers thirsty for enemy blood if we are ever pushed into a corner. Millions of soldiers? Xietain scoffed in his heart, as if such a thing were so easy. However, he said nothing about it, and after a moment's thought, Xietain decided what he would use to exchange for this Berserker Serum L.